In May 1945, a British soldier named Leonard Burney walked into Bergen-Belsen concentration camp as a liberator and found 10,000 unburied dead. He spent weeks helping survivors, carrying them to medical stations, loading skeletal frames onto stretchers, speaking softly to people whose eyes had seen horrors that would reshape the entire post-war world. Years later, he said the smell never left him. Not the physical smell, though that was real, acrid and suffocating, but the existential one. The smell of what happens when civilization decides to switch off. That's where we're starting tonight, because before we can talk about rebuilding homes, we need to understand what was taken from them. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not going to guilt you into it. And if you're watching from somewhere interesting, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing that people from all over the world are winding down together in their own corners of the planet. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in London on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Church bells are ringing. Actual bells, not the sirens you've heard for 6 years. Strangers are hugging in the streets. Band is playing somewhere. There's confetti made from shredded paper and ration books because, frankly, nobody has anything else to throw. Women in uniform are dancing with factory workers. An old man is crying against a lamppost. Someone's opened a bottle of something that's definitely not supposed to be opened yet. This is real. This is happening. The war in Europe is over. But here's the thing nobody tells you in the history books, or rather, they tell you, but you have to read it carefully. Most people didn't know what to do with themselves. After 6 years of having your life organized by sirens and blackout curtains and the constant hum of danger, suddenly there's silence. You've won, but you don't feel victorious. You feel unmoored. By May 9th, you're walking through your neighborhood in daylight without flinching. That's the first strange thing. No need to duck. No need to count the seconds between the whistle and the explosion. In London, the blackout curtains come down. Shopkeepers, those who still have shops, turn on lights they haven't turned on since 1939. Some of them just stand there staring at the illuminated windows, crying. But then you notice something else. The war is over. Yes, the Germans have surrendered. But the streets around you don't look victorious. They look exhausted. A woman next to you has been wearing the same cardigan for 3 days. The child holding her hand is pale in a way that suggests fewer calories than he should be eating. A man with one arm is sitting on a bench, and you don't know if he's thinking about something pleasant or just trying to remember what pleasant feels like. Here's a quirky fact that historians love to mention. In May 1945, some British people actually felt disappointed that the celebrations weren't bigger. After 6 years of sacrifice, they'd imagined ticker tape and parades. What they got was a cautious relief and a growing realization that winning a war doesn't automatically fix the things that winning breaks. One woman in her diary wrote that VE Day felt like winning a boxing match only to discover you can't pay the rent with the trophy. The rationing, you see, doesn't stop. In some ways, it gets worse. Because now there's no enemy to fight, no clear purpose channeling your deprivation. You're tired, and there's no noble reason for it anymore. You're hungry, and the fighting is over. So why are you still hungry? Meanwhile, across the channel, in the rubble of Germany, Leonard Burney and thousands of soldiers like him are walking into landscapes that don't look like anything that should exist. Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau. They're finding things that photography can barely capture and language completely fails to describe. The soldiers come home and try to explain it, but there are no words. So they mostly don't talk about it. They'll carry it silently for decades. And in Berlin, Berlin is going to become the symbol of everything about this moment. The capital of the 1,000-year Reich is a city of mountains, except the mountains are made of brick and steel and the lives that were pulverized inside buildings. 40% of all housing in Berlin is simply gone, not damaged. Gone, as in if you had a home there on May 7th, there's a good chance on May 8th there's just a hole where it was. In Germany, there is no celebration. There's only confusion and fear. The Soviet army is sweeping through the eastern territories. Millions of Germans are hearing rumors, terrifying rumors, about what happens when the Red Army arrives. Some of those rumors are true. Families are making impossible decisions. Stay or run, hide or hope. You're a German mother on May 10th. Your husband is dead. Your eldest son is either dead or captured somewhere in Poland. Your home has a hole in the roof that you've covered with canvas because it's May and it rains. Your younger son is 14. And there are rumors that teenage boys are being conscripted by the Soviet forces. You have two choices: the certainty of starvation in Berlin or the chaos of fleeing west into territory controlled by the British and Americans, where at least there's an abstract possibility of something better. Historians still argue whether the mass exodus of Germans from the East in 1945 was primarily driven by genuine fear of Soviet retaliation, or whether it was partly engineered by propaganda and fear-mongering. What's indisputable is that it happened. 14 million Germans began moving. 13 million would complete the journey. 1 million wouldn't. This is where we are on May 8th. The war has ended. The world is still breaking, and tomorrow, when you wake up, you're going to have to figure out how to live in a world that's been fundamentally shattered. You're walking through Berlin in July 1945. The streets are narrower than they used to be, which takes you a moment to realize. It's not that the streets have physically changed, it's that the mountains of rubble on either side have moved inward, reclaiming space like some kind of reverse growth. The Tiergarten, which used to be the city's great green lung, is now mostly stumps and ash. The smell is unique, burnt concrete and something organic underneath that you learn not to think about too hard. The sound hits you first, though. There's a specific rhythm to the destruction of a city: pickaxes, shovels, the clink of metal on brick, women's voices calling out to each other in the high, almost musical pitch that voices develop when they're being very cheerful about something that's not cheerful at all. You're seeing something that will never be recorded in military history books with proper weight. The Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women. There are 50,000 of them in Berlin alone. They're clearing 500 million cubic meters of debris. That's enough to fill the equivalent of 70,000 Olympic swimming pools with pulverized city. They do this with pickaxes and shovels and their own hands. They do it because their city needs it, because they need the work, because it's what's available to do. You watch one of them work. She's probably in her 50s, though it's hard to tell because the dust has aged everyone about 10 years on site. She's wearing a headscarf that might have once been a dress. Her hands are wrapped in cloth that might have once been a shirt. She's picking through a pile of rubble that used to be someone's home, carefully separating the bricks that can be reused from the ones that are too damaged. Beside her, another woman is hauling a bucket of salvaged materials, the smallest recyclable metal, the least damaged wood, anything that might have value. It's obsessive work because it has to be. During the war, Berlin had about 1.6 million homes. By May 1945, between the bombing and the fighting, roughly 600,000 of them are gone. The remaining homes, most of them have some damage. People are living in basements. People are living in subway tunnels. The city can't function until this rubble is cleared, and the rubble won't clear itself. Here's something that sounds like a dark joke, but is actually a historical fact. The work is organized with remarkable efficiency. The women are given quotas. They're paid. Not much, maybe something like a pack of cigarettes a day, which is worth more than official currency anyway. There's actually a system: leadership, specialization. Some women are designated as sorters, some are haulers, some are safety monitors. This is labor, organized and recognized. But, and this is where the real history gets uncomfortable, they're doing this work because there's simply no one else. The men are dead or captured or lost. The city needs to be rebuilt, and rebuilding starts with clearing away the evidence of destruction. These women are, in a very literal sense, burying their own world and making room for whatever comes next. You watch as a wall suddenly shifts. A woman near it immediately grabs another woman's arm and they both step back. The safety system works. They've learned how to do this the hard way, trial and error with very real consequences. One brick falls wrong, and you're not coming home that night. A quirky detail that the photographs don't always capture. Some of the rubble women develop a strange relationship with the objects they find: a plate, a candlestick, a photograph, partially burned. These aren't archaeological finds. They're someone's Tuesday, someone's breakfast. A woman will hold these things for a moment, maybe longer than is necessary, before deciding where they go. Are they salvageable? Are they worthy of the cart? Or should they go back into the pile that will eventually be buried under new construction? Some of the women are cheerful, genuinely. They're out in the air, working with other women, doing something tangible. It's exhausting and it's grim, but it's also a kind of purpose. One recorded account from a woman clearing the Alexanderplatz described the first moments of work as almost meditative. You're picking up rubble, your hands are doing something, your mind can go elsewhere. Most of the women aren't cheerful. They're focused. They're thinking about their next meal. They're wondering if their son is alive somewhere. They're aware that their home is probably under one of these piles, that they're clearing away the physical manifestation of their own loss. By the time you're looking at the Tiergarten in late July, certain landmarks have already been removed. The statue of Bismarck is gone. The Victory Column somehow is still standing. The buildings surrounding the park are skeletal. The Kaiser Wilhelm Church is one of the most recognizable images from this period, a church tower pointing upward against nothing, a needle of stone in a haystack of destruction. The women have names, they have stories. Margot, who's clearing rubble on Kurfürstendamm because her apartment was vaporized and she needs something to do, or she'll start screaming and never stop. Greta, who's salvaging bricks because she and her sister want to rebuild a small house somewhere, anywhere, as long as it's theirs. Helga, who's working because her husband came home from Russia without legs, and she needs income because pity doesn't pay for food. Historians still argue whether the Trümmerfrauen were symbols of German resilience or symbols of German denial. Were these women heroically rebuilding their nation, or were they being exploited by a country that had destroyed itself and needed someone to clean up the mess? The answer is probably both, and that's what makes history so exhaustingly complicated. By August, there's a strange economy developing around the rubble. The women find valuables sometimes: jewelry, leather, anything with market value. The black market is already beginning to coalesce around these discoveries, but mostly they find what was inside buildings: kitchen utensils, fabric, copper wire, glass, things that can be reused, things that the new Berlin is going to need, if it's ever going to exist again. The dust never fully goes away. Years later, Berliners will still be finding rubble, still be excavating the past. But in July 1945, the work is urgent. The city can't breathe. The city can't function. The city can't even really be imagined until the mountains of its own destruction are at least reduced to manageable hills. You're exhausted just thinking about it. The women are exhausted living it, and somehow they keep working. You're in Berlin on a Tuesday morning in November 1945. The temperature dropped overnight to -5°C, and it's going to drop further before winter's done. The forecast in the newspaper, when there's paper enough to print, suggests -20 before February. That's not metaphorically cold. That's the kind of cold that kills people who aren't expecting it. But before we get to the freezing, we need to talk about the hunger, because hunger is what's actually killing people right now. You're standing in a soup kitchen. There's no line anymore because there's nothing to eat, so the lines have become more of a persistent crowd that shifts and moves like something alive. The soup that's being distributed is a joke that stopped being funny in September. It's water with a potato that's been boiled long enough to fall apart. Some turnip if it's a good day, maybe some salt if it's a very good day. You're looking at a bowl that contains maybe 300 calories. Maybe. The official ration in Germany right now is supposed to be 800 calories a day. In reality, most people in Berlin are getting between 500 and 700. And even that's inconsistent. Let's be clear about what 800 calories means. That's not you're on a diet. That's starvation. That's your body consuming its own muscle tissue. That's children's bones developing incorrectly because calcium is being allocated by the body to things that are more immediately necessary, like keeping your heart beating. A child in Berlin right now weighs maybe 25 pounds less than he should. His mother is making decisions that shouldn't have to be decisions. Do you give your child your ration portion so he might survive to see spring? Then you become weaker. less able to work, less able to earn the money or trade goods that might get you more food. Do you eat equally, share the starvation evenly, and watch him deteriorate at the same rate as you? There is no good answer. Across the Atlantic, the American soldiers who liberated the camps, who ended the systematic murder, are getting malted milkshakes in officers' clubs. We're not saying this to be bitter. Historical fact is just historical fact. But the contrast is instructive. In the same moment that children in Berlin are developing rickets from malnutrition, American quartermaster depots are writing off surplus food as damaged goods rather than redistributing it. This doesn't mean America is uniquely cruel. It means every occupying power is more interested in controlling its zone than in feeding the people in it. The British are struggling with food shortages too. The Russians are extracting whatever they can from their zone. The French are doing what the French can. And Germany, the center, is dying of hunger. So you're going to steal. Not because you're a criminal, because your sister's infant is crying in a way that suggests her digestive system has forgotten what food is. And you've heard rumors that there are potatoes near the train station. The black market is operating in full daylight now because there is no law anymore, only occupation. The Tiergarten near the railway station is where you go if you want to find people who have things to trade. An American cigarette, a whole pack, is worth 300 marks on the black market. That's about the price of an egg before the war. 1 egg for a pack of cigarettes. Here's a quirky fact. Cigarettes have literally become the official currency of defeated Germany. The official marks are essentially valueless. Everyone knows it. So people are trading in cigarettes because cigarettes are fungible, portable, and everyone smokes or wants to. A British soldier trading cigarettes to a German woman in exchange for, well, that's entering territory that the historical record gets uncomfortable about. Let's just say the occupation has created new forms of desperation alongside the old ones. You're at Alexanderplatz on a Wednesday afternoon. The square is rubble and survivors. There are people sitting on stones who aren't part of any organization. They're just there, waiting to see if anyone has food to trade. Some of them are recent arrivals from the East, the displaced millions who fled the Soviet advance and ended up in zones controlled by the Western Allies because at least there wasn't systematic rape and execution happening, small mercies. There's a woman selling something that might be coffee. It's not coffee, it's roasted grains, maybe some chicory. Definitely nothing that came from a coffee plant. She has maybe 30 customers an hour, and she stays all day in the cold because 30 customers keeps her in business. Each cup is a cigarette or 2 marks or a button made of bone. In Britain, the situation is complicated in a different way. Britain won the war, and somehow Britain is hungrier. Bread wasn't rationed during the war. British morale couldn't handle bread rationing, apparently. But in July 1946, bread rationing begins for the first time. People in Britain are eating worse than they did during the war itself. The difference is that in Britain, there's structure. There's dignity in the ration lines. In Germany, there's desperation and the slow realization that winning a war doesn't guarantee you get fed for it. The black markets have structure too. There are dealers who operate near the train stations where displaced persons arrive and leave. There are people who've become expertise in the new economy. If you need something, food, clothing, a document, a forged identification, there's someone operating in the shadows who can get it. They're not organized in any hierarchical sense, but they're professional. This is how post-war societies function when the official systems have collapsed. You're trying not to think about what's going to happen when winter actually arrives. 15,000 Berliners died of cold and hunger in the winter of 1946. That's not a prediction. That's a fact that hasn't happened yet, but will. People will freeze in apartments with no coal. People will starve in a city that's being rebuilt by the very people who are starving. It's a logic that doesn't compute, but it's the world you're living in. Historians still argue about whether the Allied occupation policies made the hunger worse or merely failed to prevent it. The Marshall Plan, which will come in 1948, will actually save Western Europe from catastrophe. But in late 1945, there is no Marshall Plan. There's just hunger and cold waiting for winter to arrive. Right now, in November, people are preparing. Those 50,000 Trümmerfrauen clearing rubble, they're also scavenging, looking for anything burnable. Coal is controlled, wood is controlled, but there's lumber in the rubble, and some of it will burn. There's coal dust in the street that can be collected and compressed into briquettes. There are books, and yes, Germany has books, that could theoretically be burned, though most people haven't gotten that desperate yet. You're standing in the cold, holding a bowl of water with a potato in it, and you're trying to figure out how you're going to survive the next 4 months. That's the calculation happening in Berlin right now. Not how will I thrive, but will I survive? There are 40 million displaced persons across Europe. Not refugees in the modern sense, not people fleeing one country for another, displaced persons, DPs. It's a term that exists because the scale is so vast that individual categories broke down. You have Poles who were forced to work in German factories and have nowhere to go back to because their towns were liquidated. You have Jews who survived the camps and are terrified to return to the homes where they lived because that home now belongs to someone else. And sometimes that someone else remembers them being there before. You have Germans being expelled from territories that have been Polish for 500 years until yesterday, when Stalin and the Allies decided they'd be Polish again, or rather, Soviet-controlled Polish. You have Ukrainians and Latvians and Lithuanians and Yugoslavs and people from places that don't have names anymore because empires keep rearranging the map. You're in a DP camp somewhere in Germany. This is late 1945 or early 1946. The camp isn't a concentration camp. There's no murder happening here, but it's structured and it's confining, and you're here because you have nowhere else to go. The camp might be an old military barracks. It might be a section of a city that's been walled off. It might be a collection of tents. It depends on where you are and what's available. The official story from the Red Cross and the Allied occupation authorities is that these are temporary housing solutions. Everyone will go home eventually, back to Poland, back to Yugoslavia, back to Ukraine, back to wherever it is that home is. But it's 1945, and half those places don't exist in a form that would take you back, and the other half have been fundamentally changed by the fact that you weren't there for 6 years. So you're living in the camp, and it's surprisingly structured. There are actually internal governments here. The camp has a committee elected by the people who live there. There are newspapers. In some camps, multiple newspapers in multiple languages. There's a school for the children. There are cultural events. Someone organized a theater production. It's not freedom, but it's not chaos either. A quirky fact that surprises people. Some DP camps had incredibly sophisticated cultural programs. There were orchestras, there were sports leagues, there were classes in multiple languages. The historical narrative usually focuses on the suffering and the stagnation, but the actual lived experience was more complicated. People were trying to maintain humanity in a situation where humanity had been officially canceled. But the baseline reality is still hunger. The Harrison Report, published in 1945, examined American-run DP camps and found conditions that would have scandalized the American public if the American public had been paying attention. Except the American public wasn't. The war was over. The focus shifted. The DPs became an administrative problem rather than a human one. You're in a camp somewhere in Germany, and you're receiving a ration that's supposed to be 800 calories, which means it's probably 600. You're living with 200 other people in what used to be a barracks. There's no privacy. The sanitation is basic. But compared to where you came from, and wherever you came from was either a Nazi forced labor camp or a country that the Nazis destroyed, or both, it's almost stable. Your name is Moshe, maybe, and you came out of Bergen-Belsen. The British soldier who carried you to the medical station, Leonard Burney or someone like him, got you fed. Just enough that you didn't die immediately. But now you're in a camp, and you're in a kind of suspended animation. Are you going to go back to Poland? Your family is gone. Your house is gone. But Poland is still Poland, and at least it's a place where the language doesn't hurt as much. Or your name is Gregor, and you're a German who was expelled from Silesia because your grandparents had lived there. But now Silesia belongs to Poland, and the Poles want Germans out. You're in a camp on the German side of the new border, in the territory that used to be Weimar and Saxony, and is now the Soviet zone. There is literally no neutral ground anymore. Every piece of Europe has been claimed, occupied, divided, or reorganized. You're trapped in the restructuring. The camps aren't terrible compared to what came before. That's almost the problem. They're manageable. Some people actually don't want to leave because leaving means going back to uncertainty or staying in Germany in an occupation that hasn't figured out what to do with you, or walking 1,000 kilometers through war-devastated terrain hoping to find something that resembles home. In the Soviet zone, things are different. Millions of Poles and Yugoslavs and other Eastern Europeans are being repatriated, a word that implies going home, but often means going to a place that doesn't remember you and isn't sure it wants you back. Some of them will go willingly, some will go under pressure, some will go and immediately regret it. But here in the Western zones, American, British, French, the camps have become almost permanent fixtures. By 1946, some people have been in camps for longer than they were in the war. They've built lives. They've gotten jobs outside the camp, they've formed communities, they've had children born in camps, children who have no nationality because their parents' nationality doesn't exist anymore. Historians still argue about whether the DP camps were a humanitarian response to an unprecedented crisis or a continuation of the dehumanization that the war had begun. What's clear is that they're where a huge proportion of post-war Europe is living in 1945 and 1946. About 7 million DPs are in camps, 7 million people whose lives have been suspended while the world figures out what to do with them. You're at the camp administration office trying to figure out where you're going to go. The administrator is tired. He has manifests for 47 different nations, countries that don't exist, countries that exist but have changed, countries that are being reorganized by Stalin as we speak. He has no magic answers. He has paperwork. Some of the camps will eventually become more permanent settlements. Some people will stay for years. A few will become so institutionalized that they'll have to be essentially forced to leave when the camps finally close in the 1950s. They've lost the ability to imagine a world outside the fence. But the children in the camps, they're the ones who'll inherit whatever comes next. They're learning languages from the refugee community. They're playing with kids from a dozen different countries. They're developing the European consciousness that, in a weird way, the war destroyed but also created. They don't remember their nations as independent entities. They remember camps. That's going to shape the next generation in ways that nobody in 1945 can fully predict. You're looking out from the camp at the rubble beyond it. In some ways, the camp is the most functional part of Germany right now. It's organized, it's running, it's serving a purpose, even if that purpose is mainly to not die. You're in Southampton, England, January 1946. The ship is pulling into port, and on the dock there are people waving, wives, mothers, children who've never seen their father, brothers who left in 1940 and might not be the same person anymore, even if they're physically intact. The crowd is doing the thing crowds do in victory. They're cheering. But the cheering sounds hollow because everyone knows that victory isn't actually a feeling anymore. Victory is just relief mixed with a profound confusion about what happens next. You're one of about 15 million demobilized soldiers coming back to Britain, America, Germany, France, every nation that fought. The soldiers are varying states of physical and mental health. Some are intact. Some are missing limbs. Some are missing parts of themselves that don't show up on a physical examination. In Britain, you're given an £83 gratuity, roughly equivalent to a month's wages for a working man, and a set of civilian clothes. That's it. That's your transition from being a soldier with structure and purpose and a full ration to being a civilian in a nation that's almost as broke as Germany, just more politely about it. The government has called this demobilization, as if there's something orderly and planned about it. There isn't. There's just a chaos of returning soldiers, most of them traumatized to varying degrees, almost none of them prepared for what comes next. Some of them are going home to homes that don't exist anymore. The Blitz took care of that for a lot of London. You come back, and the street is recognizable, but your house is a hole. Your wife has been living in a council flat with your 3 kids. The elder boy doesn't really remember you. The youngest was born after you left and is wondering why this strange man is crying in the kitchen. A quirky fact that military historians love to mention, the British government was actually terrified that the returning soldiers would become radicalized. There was genuine fear of a communist uprising or a fascist uprising or some kind of uprising. So there was a specific effort made to ease the transition: counseling services, employment assistance, The GI Bill. Well, that's American, but Britain had similar programs. In America, the GI Bill signed June 22, 1944, is actually functioning. 8 million American veterans will eventually use education benefits to go to college. That's transformative. That's educational mobility that fundamentally reshapes what the American middle class looks like. But that's a slow burn. In 1946, the veterans are just coming home to a nation that's built up a manufacturing base during the war and is now desperate for workers and terrified of economic collapse. General Douglas MacArthur is in Japan. There are 430,000 American soldiers stationed there by the end of 1945, occupying a nation that's just as devastated as Germany, but in a different way. The soldiers are treating the occupation like a victory lap. They're comfortable. They're buying souvenirs. They're discovering that occupying a conquered nation when you're the victor is actually fairly pleasant. But back in the States, the soldiers are flooding the job market. And there's a weird social anxiety about what this means. The women who worked in factories during the war are being quietly pushed out. The assumption is that the soldiers want their jobs back, and the soldiers want normalcy, which apparently means returning to a world where women work at home. You're a soldier coming back from Europe, and you're having trouble sleeping. You're having trouble being in enclosed spaces. Loud noises make you flinch. The military calls it battle fatigue or shell shock, and they're not entirely sure what to do about it. About 1,293,000 soldiers were treated for combat fatigue during the war, but most of them were sent back to the front anyway. Now they're home, and the treatment is basically try not to think about it. Some soldiers are actually okay. They did their job, they came home, they're ready to move on. They're the ones who will fit back into society most easily. They'll find work, they'll have kids. They'll eventually have stories they tell at dinner parties that become progressively less true with each retelling. Other soldiers aren't okay. They're having nightmares, they're drinking too much. They're alienated from the people they love because how do you explain what you saw to someone who's only ever lived in peacetime? Their wife is asking why they won't go to the movies. The explosion sounds in the newsreels make them break into a cold sweat. Their mother is asking why they won't come to family dinner. Everything feels fragile and too loud and wrong. In Germany, the British soldiers occupying the Western Zone are actually part of an enormous occupation apparatus. The Potsdam Conference in July and August 1945 divided Germany into 4 zones: American, British, French, Soviet, and now there are occupation forces managing the chaos. The soldiers are supposed to keep the peace, make sure the Germans don't reconstitute the Nazi state, and help with basic governance. Some of them are learning German. Some of them are trying to understand what they're actually supposed to be doing in a nation that's been defeated so thoroughly that it barely exists as an entity anymore. The returning soldiers are also being used as a labor force for the occupation, which is fine. They're soldiers, they have structure, but the occupation is open-ended. No one knows how long it will last. The Americans assume a few years, the French assume a few years, the British assume a few years. The Soviets are not particularly communicative about their intentions. So you're a British soldier in January 1946, demobilized, given 83 pounds and a suit, and you're trying to figure out how to get a job when there are millions of other demobilized soldiers trying to get a job. And the employers want to know if you're traumatized, because traumatized soldiers are unpredictable. You're also trying to figure out how to be a husband again, or a father, or a son. You're trying to remember what normalcy felt like. Some of the soldiers are actually going to use their demobilization as an opportunity. There's a housing shortage, millions of people homeless from bombing and occupation. Some veterans are going to get loans and build houses. In America, Levittown is about to start construction, mass-produced affordable housing for veterans. 16,000 identical homes built by the same methods that built military equipment. It's efficient and it's dehumanizing, and it's actually what millions of people need right now. Historians still argue whether the return of the soldiers to their homes actually healed the societies they fought for, or whether it just imported trauma into the domestic sphere. What's clear is that the transition was chaotic. There was no master plan. There were counseling services that barely functioned. There were families trying to remember each other across the gap of 6 years, and finding that the people who came back weren't quite the people who left. The soldier in Southampton is shaking hands with a woman he recognizes as his wife, and he's wondering if this is real. The woman is wondering if the man in front of her is her husband, or a version of him that war has rewritten. They're both right to wonder. Both of them have been changed by the last 6 years. Both of them have to learn each other again. 14 million displaced Germans are moving. Millions of soldiers are coming home. Millions of DPs are waiting for countries to be restored. The rubble women are clearing 500 million cubic meters of destroyed city. People are hungry. It's winter, and it's getting colder. And somehow, all of this chaos is supposed to resolve into a new world. Tonight, as you're drifting off to sleep, imagine that you're the soldier getting off the ship, or the woman waiting on the dock, or the soldier standing in Berlin looking at mountains of brick, or the Trümmerfrauen picking through debris looking for something that can be saved. Imagine the overwhelming feeling of survival mixed with the absolute uncertainty of what comes next. That's where we are. That's where the world is. And that's where we're going to pause for the night. So while the soldiers are coming home and the rubble women are clearing the streets, there's another kind of reckoning happening. It's November 1945, and you're walking into the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, Germany. The building itself survived the war, one of the few structures intact enough to serve its new purpose. And today, that purpose is to put on trial the people who ordered it all. 24 of them sit in the dock, the major Nazi leaders who survived the war. You can see them there: Rudolf Hess, Hermann Göring with his morphine addiction and vanity, Albert Speer in his impeccably pressed suit, Joachim von Ribbentrop shifting nervously. Some of them look almost ordinary. That's maybe the most unsettling part. There's no obvious evil written across their faces. They're just men, which somehow makes it worse. The Nuremberg trials will last for 216 court sessions. You're about to watch history's first serious attempt at prosecuting crimes against humanity, and you have no idea yet if it's actually going to work. Will justice even mean anything? Can you hold people accountable for following orders, for believing in an ideology, for the systematic industrialization of murder? The prosecutors have mountains of evidence, documents, photographs, testimony from survivors and witnesses. The Allies have decided that this trial should be public, that the world should see it. Newsreels will play in cinemas. Radio stations will broadcast proceedings. Everyone needs to understand what happened and why these men are being held accountable. This is about more than punishment. It's about the official record. It's about telling the story so clearly that no one can deny it later. You listen as the charges are read: war crimes, crimes against humanity, conspiracy to wage aggressive war. Some of the defense lawyers argue that their clients were just following orders, that they didn't know the full extent of what was happening, that they were soldiers doing their duty. But the evidence keeps piling up: meeting minutes, shipping records, photographs from concentration camps. The documentation of horror is meticulous, which somehow makes it even more horrifying. The trials become a dark kind of theater. There's Göring, performing for the courtroom, trying to control the narrative, still convinced he's the smartest person in the room. There's Speer, the architect, deflecting blame while admitting he knew. There's the lesser functionaries, the men who signed papers that meant death for thousands, now claiming they didn't understand the consequences. It's exhausting to watch, even from a distance. Here's a quirky detail that historians love: the interpreters. There are simultaneous translations happening in 4 languages: English, Russian, German, French. The translators are working in booths, receiving audio through headsets, translating in real time. It's technically revolutionary for 1945. The courtroom becomes a Babel of languages. Each prosecution statement immediately available in every language, so no one can claim they didn't understand the charges. The very machinery of justice is modern and efficient. By October 1st, 1946, the verdicts come down. 12 of them are sentenced to death by hanging. 3 get life sentences, 4 get shorter prison terms, 3 are acquitted, and then there's Göring, the Reich Marshal, the man who built the Luftwaffe and bragged about his plans, the man who by all accounts was one of Hitler's closest associates. Göring gets the death sentence. He's scheduled to hang on October 16, 1946, but on October 15, the night before his execution, he bites down on a cyanide capsule he's been hiding since his arrest. They find him dead in his cell. He cheated the hangman. He denied the Allies their final symbol of justice against him. You can imagine the frustration. The whole trial was supposed to be a clean, definitive ending. Justice administered fairly through law, rather than through the chaos of war. And then one man, one final time, refuses to play by the rules. He gets to choose his own exit. Historians still argue whether allowing him this final moment of control was a failure of the guards or somehow fitting that even in death, the Nazis managed to avoid complete subjection to Allied authority. What's strange about Nuremberg is that it's simultaneously a triumph and a limited thing. It does establish that you can hold leaders accountable for atrocities, that crimes against humanity exist as a legal concept, that the world will bear witness, but it also only tried the highest-level Nazis. What about all the others? The thousands of bureaucrats, the camp guards, the informants, the businessmen who profited, they're scattered across Europe, some of them already rebuilding their lives. The trials create a template for something new in international law, but they also reveal something uncomfortable. It's much easier to prosecute the obvious villains than it is to address the systemic nature of complicity. The mid-level people who made the machine work are harder to pin down. Their crimes are more diffuse. They can claim ignorance more credibly. Some of them will never face justice. Some will be living in your neighborhood in a few years, under assumed names or no names at all, just moving forward. But for now, in the autumn of 1946, you're watching something that feels important. The machinery of international justice is slow and imperfect, but it's turning. The Allies are saying that there is such a thing as a crime too terrible to forgive, and that even the most powerful leaders can be held accountable for it. It's not clean. It's not perfect. But it's something. The Palace of Justice stands as a monument to that attempt. The trials will be studied for decades. Law schools will teach them. They'll become the foundation for every international tribunal that comes after. And while it won't bring back anyone who was murdered, while it won't undo any of the damage, while some of the guilty will slip away, it does say something about what the world thinks it believes in. Justice, accountability, the rule of law mattering more than the will of the strong. That matters, even as you're exhausted from everything else that still needs to be rebuilt. You might think that peace would mean abundance, that the war's end would open floodgates, that rationing would ease and things would get better. But you're in Britain now, and if you're paying attention, you're noticing something strange. Things are actually getting worse. Back during the war, at least the rationing had a purpose everyone understood. You were feeding soldiers, you were winning, the hardship had meaning. But now it's 1946, the war's been over for nearly a year in Europe, and the government is telling you that rationing is going to get tighter. More cuts, fewer resources, less food. Your government, now led by the Labour Party under Clement Attlee in a landslide victory from July 1945, is making a choice about what recovery looks like, and it's not immediately comfortable. You get 24 clothing coupons for 8 months. From September 1945 through April 1946. 24. Let's think about what that means. A man's shirt might take 6 or 7 coupons. A coat takes 14. A pair of shoes takes maybe 7. So in 8 months, you could theoretically buy either one decent coat or maybe a shirt, some socks, and hope nothing else needs replacing. Your winter coat has a hole in it? You'd better learn to patch. Your shoes are wearing through? Get creative with newspaper or cardboard in the soles. And then there's bread. This is where it gets genuinely bizarre. Bread was not rationed during the war. Not in Britain. They had meat rationing, butter rationing, sugar rationing, but bread. Bread was something everyone could have. It was seen as essential. But in July 1946, the government institutes bread rationing for the first time, ever. They call it scientific rationing, implying that they're being smart about it, managing resources carefully. What you hear is, things are so bad that we're rationing the one thing we didn't ration even when we were fighting for survival. The winter of 1946 to 1947 is coming, and it's going to be one of the worst on record, one of the coldest, hardest winters of the century. The coal mines can't keep up with demand. The railway systems fail under the weight of ice and snow. Factories have to close because they can't get fuel. The power cuts rolling through the country last for hours at a time. You sit in your darkened kitchen, your breath visible, and you wonder how this is possible. You won, didn't you? But here's what's actually happening, and it's more complicated than just the government being cruel. Britain is broke. Genuinely, profoundly, almost inconceivably broke. They borrowed massive amounts during the war, mostly from America, and now they're in debt they can't easily pay back. The Lend-Lease program that kept Britain supplied during the war has ended. The economy has to shift from wartime production back to civilian production, but factories can't just flip a switch. Raw materials are scarce everywhere. The empire is starting to crack. India is moving toward independence. Other colonies are restless. The global economy is in chaos, so the government makes a decision. They're going to use their scarcity to build something new. They're going to create the welfare state. And right now, while you're cold and hungry, that might seem like a bad trade, but listen to what they're actually trying to do. Here's the quirky detail. Part of what makes the austerity feel real and legitimate in the British mind is that it's universal. It's not that poor people are suffering while rich people eat well. The rationing system, in theory and largely in practice, applies to everyone. A lord gets the same butter ration as a factory worker. A duchess gets the same clothing coupons as a nurse. There's something almost noble about it, this shared sacrifice. You're all in it together, and psychologically, that makes deprivation feel less like injustice and more like collective duty. Everyone's belt is being tightened equally. And while they're tightening everyone's belt, they're building the National Health Service. The NHS is established in 1948, and it's going to be free at the point of use for everyone. No more paying for a doctor's visit if you can't afford it. No more choosing between medicine and rent. It's revolutionary. It's radical. It's also expensive, which is one reason why bread is being rationed for the first time in British history. The government is essentially saying, we're poor, so we're going to redistribute what little we have. We're going to make sure everyone has basic health care. We're going to build public housing. We're going to create unemployment benefits and pension systems. And to do that, we need everyone to accept that things are going to be tight for a while. The austerity isn't temporary hardship before returning to normal. It's the cost of building something different. You might not understand this framing when you're standing in the cold, waiting for the power to come back on. You might just feel angry and tired. But in the political and intellectual circles of 1946, this is being discussed as something noble. This is the cost of creating a fairer society. This is the sacrifice necessary to build a modern welfare state. Labor won the election because people believed in this vision. They wanted change, not just a return to the old way of doing things. Historians still argue about whether the austerity was necessary or self-inflicted. Some say the government could have negotiated better terms with America, could have managed the economy differently. Others say that given the debts and the global chaos, this was the only possible path. What's certain is that by 1947, Britain is cold, hungry, and betting everything on the idea that this suffering has a purpose. So you endure. You patch your clothes. You queue for your rations. You accept the power cuts. And you tell yourself, or maybe the government tells you, that this is what building a better world looks like. Not easy, not comfortable, but fair. Democratic, built on the idea that everyone matters, not just the people with money. That's the story of British austerity in 1946. The victory that feels like loss, at least for a while. While Britain is rationing bread for the first time, Germany itself is being carved up like a continental cake at a conference nobody quite trusts. You're in July and August of 1945, which is technically still during the war against Japan, and in a place called Potsdam, just outside Berlin, the Big Three are meeting one final time. Truman for America, Stalin for the Soviet Union, and Churchill for Britain, and then Clement Attlee when Churchill loses the election mid-conference. Awkward. They're deciding what happens to Germany. Not through war, through pencil and paper and hours of negotiation and barely concealed distrust. And what they decide is to divide Germany into 4 zones. American, British, Soviet, and French. Each occupying power gets a piece. It's supposed to be temporary, a way of administering the occupied country until it can govern itself again. It will actually last for decades. You're now in one of these zones. Which zone you're in matters enormously for your daily life. If you're in the Soviet zone, things are going to be very different than if you're in the American zone. The Soviets are looking at Germany as reparations, as territory to be exploited. Their zone becomes a place of systematic extraction and control. In the Soviet thinking, all major landowners are Nazis, literally or spiritually. Land gets redistributed, industry gets dismantled or redirected to Soviet needs. Political control is total. The American, British, and French zones are supposed to work together. There's supposed to be an Allied Control Council that issues joint directives, that makes sure the occupation is coordinated, that creates some kind of unified policy. But it doesn't work. Not really. The Soviets have one vision, the Western Allies have another. The coordination breaks down almost immediately. What you get instead is de facto partition. The Soviet zone develops one way, the Western zones develop another way. In Berlin, the situation is especially strange. Berlin is in the Soviet zone, geographically speaking. It's surrounded by Soviet territory, but because Berlin is the capital, the Allies decided it needs to be divided too. So there's an American sector, a British sector, a French sector, and a Soviet sector. Berlin becomes a little microcosm of the Cold War, decades before people even have a name for it. The sectors are supposed to be coordinated through an Allied Kommandatura, joint command, but again, it doesn't work. You've got 4 different occupying powers in one city, and they're increasingly hostile to each other. Your daily life depends entirely on which sector you're in. In the American and British sectors, you can see American and British uniforms. The food situation is bad, but not catastrophic. The Western Allies bring in food, keep the population from starving. The control is real, but it's also, by the standards of occupation, relatively light-handed. You need permits for travel. You need to respect the curfews, but you can also engage in a kind of black market economy. And eventually, you can imagine life returning to something like normalcy. In the Soviet sector, everything is different. The Soviets aren't interested in keeping the population comfortable. They're extracting everything they can. Equipment gets dismantled and shipped east. Skilled workers get conscripted for work in the Soviet Union. Food is scarcer. The secret police are visible and brutal. If you're a German who fought in the Wehrmacht, or if you're a factory owner, or if you're just someone who speaks up, you can disappear. The justice system, if you can call it that, is summary and political rather than legal. Here's the quirky reality that shapes everything. The occupying soldiers don't actually want to be there. American GIs are desperate to go home. They're thousands of miles from their families. They're angry about the slow demobilization process. In December 1945, there are actual riots, the Bring the Boys Home movement. Soldiers refusing orders, marching on military bases demanding discharge. The military hierarchy is baffled. These guys just won the war. Why are they so unhappy? The answer is simple. Because war is over and they want to go home. The occupation, from the GI perspective, is just more war without the fighting. It's boring and pointless and far from everyone they love. The British and French soldiers have similar feelings, though they're perhaps more stoic about it, more willing to see occupation as a necessary responsibility. But even they are stretched thin. They don't have enough troops to administer a country of 60 million people. So local German officials end up doing a lot of the actual administration. The occupation is, in practice, often run by Germans under Allied supervision, which creates this strange situation where power structures that should have been completely broken are instead just reorganized. The intention was always that Germany would be demilitarized, denazified, and then allowed to rebuild as a democracy. But the practical implementation is messy and contradictory. Different zones pursue different versions of denazification. In the American zone, they use a questionnaire to determine who was actually a Nazi, but it's so broad that millions of ordinary people get caught up in it. In the British zone, they're more pragmatic. If you're useful and not a war criminal, you can stay in your job. The Soviet zone does its own version, which is more about politics than about actual Nazi affiliation. Historians still argue about whether the 4-zone system was inevitable or a choice that could have gone differently. Could the Allies have maintained unity? Could they have negotiated a shared vision? Or was the conflict built in from the beginning, with the Soviets and Americans just too fundamentally opposed to work together? The answer probably depends on who you ask, but what's clear is that by 1946, the zones are developing in radically different directions. You live in this divided reality. Depending on where you are, Germany is either slowly recovering or being systematically stripped of everything valuable. You might be able to buy things on the black market, or you might just be trying to survive. You see soldiers who aren't your countrymen walking the streets. You're not free, but you're not quite enslaved either. You're in a strange liminal space where the war has ended, but the war is not really over. And the longer the zones remain separate, the harder reunification will be. The infrastructure will diverge. The political systems will diverge. The economies will diverge. What was supposed to be temporary will start to look permanent. But you don't know that yet. You just know that you're divided, and that the four powers dividing you don't seem to agree on anything. You're hungry, and you notice something strange happening in the German markets. Or rather, you notice that American cigarettes are becoming more valuable than money. This is one of those historical facts that's so weird that it almost doesn't feel real, but it is. An American pack of cigarettes is worth roughly 300 marks on the black market. The official exchange rate at the time is maybe 5 marks to $1, but cigarettes are currency. American GIs are being paid in cigarettes as part of their rations, and they're trading them for German marks, for food, for sex, for information, for anything. The German currency, the Reichsmark, has been so inflated and so compromised by the war that it's basically worthless. But cigarettes? Everyone wants cigarettes. Everyone smokes. Or if they don't smoke, they can trade the cigarettes for something they do want. So a new economy emerges. It's called Zigarettenwährung, cigarette currency. And it's not just a fun fact for history books, it's the actual mechanism by which things get traded. You can't buy bread with marks anymore because the baker doesn't trust the currency. But if you bring American cigarettes, you can negotiate. You can get things. The economy has reverted to barter, but with cigarettes as the medium of exchange. By June 1946, the German Reichsmark is so worthless that 50% of all German trade is happening through barter. 50%. No money involved. Someone has potatoes, someone else has a shirt, they make a trade. Someone has coffee, someone has tools, they figure out an exchange. It's like watching economics regress 300 years in real time. Money still exists, but it's not being used for anything that matters. You adapt to this reality. If you're in a zone where American soldiers are present, you develop relationships with them. You figure out their hours, their locations, their preferences. Maybe you have access to something they want, local liquor or information, or just the chance to escape the barracks for an evening. You trade it for cigarettes. You go home with a pack or two, and you suddenly have real purchasing power. It's survival capitalism. It's morally complicated, but it's how people eat. The black market becomes the real market. The official channels, the rationing system, the government shops, these are supplements to the real economy happening on the streets. And the real economy is driven by demand for goods that exist in scarcity and supply from sources that are technically illegal. American soldiers stealing rations to trade, farmers hiding grain to sell at black market prices, smugglers moving goods across zone boundaries. It's chaotic and it's corrupt, and it's also the only way the economy actually functions. Here's a quirky aspect that most people don't think about. The black market actually makes people more equal in a weird way. You can't use your old money to buy things. You can't use your official job or your social status. What matters is what you have to trade and what you're willing to trade it for. A former Nazi official and a former factory worker are on the same footing if neither of them has cigarettes and both of them are hungry. The hierarchy of the past has been flattened, not through justice, but through economic collapse. Everyone's desperate. Everyone's trading. Everyone's slightly criminal. The military and the occupation authorities try to suppress the black market. They fail. You can't suppress it because it's not a separate system. It is the system. The moment you prevent trade, you prevent people from eating. The moment you try to enforce the use of Reichsmarks, you break the economy entirely. So the black market becomes semi-official. The authorities know about it, tolerate it, occasionally crack down on particularly egregious examples just to maintain the appearance of control. The cigarette economy creates strange hierarchies. The GIs who have access to the best cigarettes, premium American brands, become wealthy overnight. They can live like kings in a country that's economically destroyed. They can buy black market cognac, can pay for services at rates that would be unthinkable in America, can basically purchase influence and pleasure without limits. Some of them are decent about it. Some of them are exploitative. The relative strength of the American economy compared to the German economy creates a power imbalance that's both economic and deeply unsettling. You learn the exchange rates like they're vital information because they are. How many cigarettes for a kilo of butter? How many for a suit? How many for someone to help you move? How many for someone to forge papers for you? The cigarette becomes a language. It's the common denominator of value. Historians still argue about whether the cigarette economy prolonged the collapse of the official German currency or accelerated it. Was the black market a necessary adaptation to an impossible situation, or did it actively prevent the reconstruction of a functioning economy? The truth is probably that it was both. Without the black market, people would have starved faster. With the black market, the official economy couldn't recover because nobody trusted it anymore. But for you, living through it, these are abstractions. What matters is that you figured out how to survive using currency that literally comes in packs with instructions on how to roll it into a cigarette. You're trading smokes for bread. You're learning that value is whatever two people agree it is, and right now, everyone agrees that American cigarettes have value, so that's what you use. It's not sustainable, of course. Eventually, the currency will be reformed. New money will be introduced that people trust. The black market will shrink, though it will never disappear entirely. But for now, in 1946, in the chaos and rubble, cigarettes are money. And if you're smart and you have access to them, you're rich. There's something almost invisible happening in 1946, something that no one's really talking about because it's complicated and uncomfortable, and because in the afterglow of victory, it's easier to not examine it too closely. Women are being quietly, systematically removed from the jobs they've been doing for the past 5 or 6 years. You were essential during the war. You know this. You worked in factories making ammunition, building engines for planes, assembling radios. You worked in hospitals as nurses. You worked in fields bringing in harvests because the men were gone. You worked on the buses driving people around cities while bombs fell. You worked as police officers and air raid wardens and in intelligence services. You wore uniforms. You made real money. You had independence and responsibility and purpose. And then the war ended. And now you're being told, politely but firmly, that you should go home. The men are coming back. The logic goes. They need their jobs. The economy needs to transition to peacetime production, and peacetime production is men's work, family men with wives and children earning the family wage, providing the stability. There's the implication, sometimes spoken and sometimes just understood, that you were doing men's jobs temporarily as an emergency measure. The emergency is over, time to return to normal. Except you don't want to return to normal. You've tasted something different. You've had your own paycheck. You've made decisions. You've done work that mattered. You've had colleagues and purposes beyond domestic life. The thought of going back to being dependent, to being confined, to being told what to do by a husband or father is suffocating. But the pressure is enormous. The government, the employers, society in general, they're all pushing toward restoration of the old order. In Britain, women are laid off from factories as production shifts. The rationing system, which you've been navigating and managing and making work, is suddenly portrayed as something temporary that will ease once the men are home to handle things. You notice the contradiction. The government is rationing bread for the first time, yet they're telling you that things will get better. The message they're actually sending is, things will get better for men. Your burden will be simplified because you'll have less responsibility, less choice, less of everything. A quirky and often overlooked detail. Women in Britain get 24 clothing coupons for 8 months, but there's an assumption built in that these coupons are also covering children's clothes. So a woman's clothing allowance is actually being stretched to cover kids, meaning she gets less than even these minimal numbers suggest. Meanwhile, men are expected to have work clothes that last, uniforms if applicable, and their rations are being calculated on the assumption that someone else, presumably a woman at home, will be managing household resources and making things stretch. The system itself is designed to push you toward domestic life by making independence materially harder. You see jobs being reclassified. Work that was perfectly acceptable for women during the war is suddenly being declared unsuitable for women in peacetime. Police work, for example. You were trusted with it when there was chaos. Now that there's order being restored, you're being told it's too rough, too dangerous, too male. It's not that your capabilities have changed. It's that the opportunity has changed. Some women resist. Some women refuse to leave. Some organize, demanding equal pay for equal work, demanding the right to keep their jobs. There are strikes, petitions, arguments about fairness, but the culture is against them. You're portrayed as selfish if you want to keep working, as denying jobs to men who deserve them because they fought the war. The fact that many women also fought the war, as soldiers, as resistance members, as resistance fighters, is downplayed or ignored. And there's another layer to it. If you kept working, who was managing the home? The children were being raised by strangers, or by older women, or by each other. The house wasn't being maintained. Meals weren't being cooked by wives who were meant to cook them. Society had adapted to women's absence by creating alternative structures. Now those alternative structures are being dismantled. The government is introducing allowances for mothers who stay home. Tax policy is designed to assume a single male earner with a dependent wife. Childcare facilities that were built during the war are being closed. In some cases, women were literally forced out. Marriage bars existed in some sectors. If you got married, you were required to resign. So, even the women who had fought for the right to keep their jobs found that getting married meant losing them. The choice was work or family, and society was making it very clear which one was the right choice. Here's something historians still argue about: how much of this was deliberate policy, and how much of it was just the inevitable social reassertion of traditional values. Were there actual government directives pushing women out of jobs, or was it just that employers and society naturally reverted to pre-war thinking? The evidence suggests it was a bit of both. There were deliberate choices about closing childcare facilities, about changing job classifications, about tax policy. But there was also a pervasive cultural assumption that the war was the aberration and peacetime domesticity was the natural order. You feel this pressure not just from society, but sometimes from the men in your life. Your father might suggest that you should focus on finding a husband. Your brothers might think it's inappropriate for you to be the main earner in the household. Even sympathetic men had been trained their whole lives to believe that they were the providers, and your working was somehow a commentary on their adequacy. So many of you go home. Some reluctantly, some because you don't have a choice, some because the job market becomes too hostile to stay in. You trade factories for houses. You trade independence for stability, though the stability is often financial, dependent on a man's employment, and therefore ultimately as precarious as it always was. But something has changed in you. You know what you're capable of. You know what work you can do. You know that you can make decisions and manage things and contribute. You can't unknow that. And that knowledge, for millions of women across Europe, will become the seed of changes that haven't happened yet, but are coming. The push back home is real, but it's also incomplete. Because once you've worked, once you've tasted independence, going home isn't the same as it was before. It's a retreat, but it's a conscious retreat. And the next generation of women will be watching and remembering and deciding they want something different. For now, though, you're home. Maybe you're relieved to be away from the danger and the exhaustion. Maybe you're angry and resentful. Maybe you're trying to make peace with what you've lost and focus on what you have. The choice isn't really being given to you, but you have to make peace with it anyway. So here you are in September 1945, and if you thought Europe was a mess, well, you haven't seen Japan yet. General Douglas MacArthur arrives in Tokyo with the kind of theatrical flair he's perfected over decades of military theater. The man literally gets off a plane wearing aviators and a corncob pipe like he's starring in his own war movie. By the end of 1945, There are 430,000 American soldiers stationed across Japan, and they're not there to party. They're there to remake an entire nation from the ground up. Tokyo itself is almost unrecognizable. The firebombing campaigns of the previous spring destroyed 16 square miles of the city in a single night, a night that killed more than 100,000 people. Though you probably haven't heard much about that particular statistic, the city looks like something from a nightmare. Miles and miles of ash, twisted metal, and rubble where neighborhoods used to be. The Japanese people, who've just surrendered after years of being told they'd fight to the last person, are stunned. Their emperor, Hirohito, whom they'd been raised to believe was literally divine, is still alive, and MacArthur has decided to keep him around, which surprises absolutely everyone. Here's where it gets interesting. MacArthur, this American general who basically answers to no one, decides that Japan needs a complete overhaul. A new government, a new constitution, a new way of being. On January 1st, 1946, Emperor Hirohito makes an announcement that shocks the nation. He declares his humanity, not metaphorically, literally. He announces that he is not, in fact, a god, and that this whole divinity thing was basically mythology. You can imagine how that conversation went. So, Your Imperial Majesty, we're going to need you to tell 100 million people that you're human and always have been. The historians still argue whether this was a genius move at preventing Japanese militarism from ever returning, or whether MacArthur just got very lucky with a decision that could have backfired spectacularly. MacArthur's occupation doesn't look like traditional military occupation. There are no Soviet tanks rolling through the streets. There's no pillaging or mass revenge. Instead, it looks like America trying to install democracy at gunpoint, or rather, at the tip of a pen. The occupation authorities write a new constitution, and here's the thing, it's actually pretty democratic. Women get the vote. Land reform breaks up the feudal estate system. Labor unions become legal. It's like taking a country that's been running on authoritarian fumes and suddenly switching the engine to constitutional monarchy, all in the space of a few months. And the Japanese people, exhausted and traumatized, mostly go along with it. Why? Because the alternative is chaos. MacArthur is actually not terrible to them. He ensures food shipments don't completely vanish. He prevents mass starvation, and he maintains a kind of order that, while foreign, beats the hell out of the uncertainty they're living in. The occupation even has a surprising benefit. It ends the systematic oppression of women that's been baked into Japanese law for centuries. Sure, it's happening under military occupation, which is weird, but women can suddenly own property, work jobs other than domestic service, and participate in government. Progress looks strange when it comes at the barrel of a gun, but it's still progress. On November 3rd, 1946, almost exactly a year after Japan surrenders, the new constitution is promulgated. It'll officially take effect on May 3rd, 1947, and by then, something remarkable has already happened. On April 10th, 1946, Japan holds its first post-war election, and women vote in it. In fact, 78.52% of eligible men turn out to vote, which is respectable, but 66.97% of women vote despite never having had the right to vote in their entire lives. They line up at polling stations with no prior experience in democracy and participate anyway. You're watching something happen in real time that took Britain 20 years of suffragette struggle and America decades of organizing. Women getting the vote, just like that, through constitutional fiat. The elected government, unsurprisingly, leans left. Japanese voters choose socialist candidates because they're desperate for change, and the socialists promise economic reform. But MacArthur's not particularly worried about it. He's got the military to back him up, and in any case, the Cold War is starting to shift American priorities. Communism is becoming the real enemy in American minds, and that means the occupation is quietly shifting away from radical democratization and towards stability, even if stability means tolerating some less than democratic elements of the old Japanese system that get quietly restored. But from where you're sitting in 1946 or 1947, living in the ruins of Tokyo or Osaka or Hiroshima, what matters is that something entirely new is being built. Your children will grow up under a different system. Your daughter can go to school and imagine a future that isn't just wife and mother. Your son can learn about democracy in a classroom. The old imperial system that tried to conquer Asia and nearly destroyed itself in the process is gone. In its place is something that looks, at least on paper, like a functioning democracy. Whether it'll actually work is a question no one can answer yet. But let's talk about the kids for a moment, because if the adults are traumatized, and they absolutely are, the children are living in a kind of surreal alternate reality that historians are still trying to fully document. You're a child in Berlin or Warsaw or Dresden in 1946. Everything you knew is gone. Your school? Rubble. Your neighborhood? Rubble. Your street? Rubble. Sometimes you can barely remember what the city looked like before the bombs. You and your friends live in the rubble now, not metaphorically, literally in it. You play in destroyed buildings, hunting for anything useful, bits of metal that might be worth something, wood for fuel, anything edible. You learn to navigate collapsed streets like they're a natural part of the landscape. Your parents are too busy trying to find food to worry about where you are most of the time. There are millions of you across Europe, and you're growing up with a childhood that's almost unimaginable to people who didn't live through it. In East Prussia, there's a particular category of children that the Germans call Wolfskinder, wolf children. These are kids, sometimes as young as 4 or 5, whose families were killed or displaced or simply scattered in the chaos of the war's final months and the Soviet advance. They're roaming around on their own, in packs, scavenging for food. Sleeping in bombed-out buildings or in the forests, some of them have probably forgotten what their original families even looked like. They survive by stealing, by eating whatever they can find, by relying on each other. You're looking at childhood as raw survival, stripped of everything else. School, childhood games, parental comfort, these are luxuries that don't exist. The thing that gets to historians is how these children adapt. They don't just suffer and die. Well, many of them do, but many don't. They develop a kind of feral intelligence, a capability for survival that seems almost impossible for someone who grew up in safety. They know which neighborhoods have the best pickings for food. They know which rubble heaps are dangerous and which ones are stable enough to scavenge in. They learn to work as teams. By all accounts, they're often healthier and more resilient than children who stayed with families but had access to actual rations because they're so driven by survival instinct. The psychological cost, though, is something else entirely. When these children eventually get recovered, through relief organizations, through Soviet authorities, through sheer luck, many of them struggle with trauma that no one really has a name for yet. They've learned that the world is chaos, that adults can't be trusted, that you need to depend only on yourself. Some of them never recover from that. Some of them become adults who can't form stable relationships. Some of them carry that feral childhood with them for the rest of their lives. But here's the thing that historians still argue about. Did growing up in the rubble actually create a generation that was, in some ways, tougher and more resilient than their counterparts in other countries? You had German children and Polish children and Russian children who grew up surrounded by literal evidence that civilization could collapse at any moment. They learned early that institutions can fail you, that you can't assume safety or security or structure. Is that traumatic? Absolutely. Is it also a kind of education in how fragile everything is? Maybe. Some historians suggest that the post-war German economic miracle partly happened because that generation of rubble children grew up to be adults who weren't afraid of hard work or rebuilding from nothing. They'd literally done it as kids, so why not do it again as economic policy? There's also the matter of missing people. Millions of children lost parents. Millions of parents lost children. The displacement networks try to reunite families, but it's a chaotic, desperate process. You see notices posted on walls. Looking for Johann Müller, age 8, last seen in Dresden, May 1945. If you know the whereabouts of Anna and Peter Hoffmann, please contact. These postings are everywhere, in every city, in every language. Some families eventually reunite. Many never do. Some children spend years in orphanages not knowing whether their parents are alive or dead. Some parents spend decades not knowing if their children survived. The European Relief Organizations, UNICEF, is founded in 1946 specifically to help children in this exact situation struggle to cope with the sheer scale of the problem. You've got millions of displaced, orphaned, or separated children, and the infrastructure to help them basically doesn't exist yet. Some get sent to orphanages that are themselves barely functioning. Some get adopted by families who can't quite provide what they need but try anyway. Some, incredibly, manage to just find their way. Street children, scavengers, kids who learn to survive by their wits alone. And yet, weirdly, a lot of these children don't remember their childhoods as exclusively horrible. Sure, they were hungry and scared and often alone, but they also had freedom, a kind of freedom that children in stable countries couldn't imagine. No school uniforms to worry about, no curfews, no homework. Just the vastness of a destroyed city to explore and the company of other children in the same situation. Some of them, years later, will talk about those years with a kind of strange nostalgia, remembering the adventure and camaraderie alongside the hunger and trauma. It's complicated. Childhood always is. But when your childhood is the rubble of a war zone, it's complicated in ways that are almost incomprehensible to someone who grew up in safety. Now let's shift perspective for a moment. You're an American soldier coming home in 1945 or 1946, and you're walking off a ship onto American soil for the first time in years. You've survived the war. Congratulations. Statistically, you're lucky. Somewhere around 400,000 American soldiers didn't make it home. But you did. So what now? For millions of American veterans, the answer comes in the form of something called the GI Bill, passed back in 1944 when everyone was still fighting the war and trying to imagine what peacetime would look like. The bill is almost absurdly generous by any measure. It pays for your college education if you want one. It guarantees low-interest loans for home purchases. It provides unemployment benefits. It's like the government is saying, look, you sacrificed years of your life for us. We're going to help you build a new one. By the end, about 8 million veterans will use the education benefits, which is genuinely transformative. Americans who never would have gone to college, working-class kids, rural kids, kids from families that didn't have money for that kind of thing, suddenly get free education. It fundamentally reshapes the American labor force and middle class in ways that will echo for decades. But the really visible change isn't in universities, it's in the suburbs. Or rather, in the creation of suburbs as a concept that actually exists in America. You're familiar with wealthy suburbs, sure, places outside cities where rich people have big houses and land. But the suburbs that start developing after the war are something different. They're mass-produced, they're cheap, they're designed specifically for veterans with low-income GI Bill loans who need to find affordable housing in a market where there literally isn't enough housing. Enter Levittown, New York. In 1947, a developer named William Levitt starts building houses on farmland on Long Island. Not a few houses, thousands. By the time he's done, there are 17,447 homes in Levittown, and each one costs about $7,990, which sounds like nothing now, but in 1947, it's perfectly positioned for what a working-class veteran with a GI Bill loan can afford. The houses are small, efficient, and virtually identical. Some people make fun of them for being cookie-cutter and boring, and they're right, they kind of are. But they're also affordable, clean, brand new, and yours. For a veteran coming back from the Pacific or Europe, the idea of owning a home, an actual home that you own, not that you rent, is revolutionary. Levittown becomes a model. Similar developments pop up all over the country. Suddenly, instead of living in a crowded urban apartment or a rural farmhouse, you can live in a brand new suburban home with modern plumbing, electric heating, and enough space for a family. And speaking of families, you're probably thinking about starting one now that the war's over. You survived. You want to build something. You want kids. The United States in 1946 experiences something called the baby boom. In that single year, 3.4 million babies are born in America. That's a staggering number for a single year. It's not just America. It's happening in other countries too. Everywhere people survived the war and are trying to build new lives. You're looking at a fundamental demographic shift in real time. All these new babies need homes, food, schools, everything. The American economy, which has been running at full capacity producing weapons and military equipment, suddenly needs to convert to producing consumer goods. Refrigerators, cars, washing machines, diapers, toys. Here's where the irony gets thick. The GI Bill, which is explicitly designed to help poor and working-class veterans build lives, inadvertently creates a massive wealth inequality problem that'll take decades to fully unfold. White veterans get access to low-interest loans and suburban homes. Black veterans often get denied the same loans, redlined out of white neighborhoods, steered toward worse mortgages with higher interest rates, the same government benefit that launches millions of white Americans into the middle class basically excludes Black Americans from accessing it, at least in practice. The law says everyone's eligible. Real estate agents and banks say otherwise. And that structural racism becomes baked into the American housing market in ways that'll create wealth gaps that persist for generations. But in the moment, you're not thinking about that if you're a white American veteran in 1946. You're thinking about finally sleeping in a bed that's your own, a house with a front yard, maybe a car parked out front, a wife, kids, a job that pays well enough to support a family. The American dream, as it's starting to be called, is suddenly within reach for working-class people in a way it never quite has been before. Sure, it requires you to move to the suburbs, which means commuting to the city for work, which requires a car, which requires infrastructure, which the government is now investing in. It's all connected. The interstate highway system, authorized by Congress in 1956, will be explicitly designed partly to allow suburban commuters to get to jobs in cities. You're watching the physical reshaping of America in real time, and it's all built on the assumption that workers can afford cars and suburban homes because the government is subsidizing them. So you're a veteran and life is looking up. Your parents survived the Depression, you survived the war, and now, through a combination of government generosity and American industrial capacity, you get to live a kind of life that would have been unimaginable to your grandfather. You never think that this period of broadly shared prosperity, this idea that a working-class person can own a home and send their kids to college, might be an anomaly. You assume this is just how America works now. You have no idea it won't last. It's June 5th, 1947, and you're sitting in an auditorium at Harvard University, possibly literally, or you're hearing about what happens there through a radio or newspaper. Secretary of State George Marshall, the same general who planned the invasion of Normandy, who's now in a suit running the State Department, gives a speech that will reshape the entire post-war world. The speech itself isn't particularly dramatic. Marshall was never much for rhetoric. He speaks clearly and directly about a problem. Europe is starving, economically devastated, and probably going to turn communist unless something dramatic happens. European governments are stable only because American food shipments are keeping people from rioting. The Soviet Union is consolidating control over Eastern Europe. Western Europe is on the brink of economic collapse. And America can either spend a fortune keeping Europe economically dependent through charity, or America can spend a fortune rebuilding Europe in a way that creates actual prosperity and stable, non-communist governments. Which sounds better? The brilliance of the Marshall Plan, which is what the newspapers immediately start calling his proposal, isn't that it's generous, it's that it's enlightened self-interest wrapped in humanitarian language. America will provide massive economic aid to European countries that agree to certain conditions: free markets, economic integration with each other, transparent accounting. In return, America gets stable, democratic allies, a market for American goods, and a buffer against Soviet expansion. It's win-win, or at least it looks that way to American policymakers. Congress approves it. On April 3, 1948, the bill is signed into law, and over the next 4 years, $13.3 billion flows from America to Western Europe. That's roughly $150 billion in modern money, and it's a staggering amount of wealth transferred across the Atlantic at a moment when Europe is basically helpless without it. Historians still argue whether the Marshall Plan single-handedly saved Western Europe or whether Europe would have recovered eventually without it, but what's not arguable is that it absolutely shaped the post-war world. America becomes the dominant economic power. Western Europe becomes dependent on American goodwill, and a certain kind of transatlantic relationship gets established that'll persist for decades. The distribution of Marshall Plan money is revealing. Britain, having been America's closest ally and having basically bankrupted itself fighting the war, gets 26% of the funds. France, which spent the war either under Nazi occupation or fighting in resistance, gets 18%. West Germany, which, remember, America just spent 5 years bombing into submission, gets 11%. This is remarkable. America is basically paying to rebuild the enemy because the strategic calculus has changed. Germany is no longer an enemy to be punished. Germany is a potential bulwark against Soviet expansion. So, Germany gets rebuilt. German industry starts functioning again. German economy starts growing, and German citizens start remembering what stability and economic prosperity feel like. The irony isn't lost on British people, who watch their former enemy Germany get massively rebuilt while Britain itself is tightening austerity belts even further. British rations are actually getting worse in 1947 and 1948, not better. Bread rationing, which didn't exist during the actual war, is introduced after it ends. Britain is so broke that they're basically depending on American loans and Marshall Plan money just to avoid complete economic collapse. There's a real bitterness about watching Germany get rebuilt while Britain, the country that stood alone against Hitler, that refused to surrender when everyone thought they'd lose, is getting poorer. It's one of the reasons Britain's empire starts fragmenting so rapidly in the post-war years. Britain simply can't afford to maintain imperial possessions anymore. India gets independence in 1947. Africa starts demanding independence too. The British Empire is withdrawing not because anyone's forcing them to, but because they literally can't afford to stay. The Marshall Plan also represents a shift in American foreign policy that's almost revolutionary in its scope. Before the war, America was isolationist, genuinely, deeply opposed to being involved in European affairs. Americans had fought in World War I, which didn't work out great, so after that, America basically said, "We're not doing this anymore. Europe is Europe's problem." Now, suddenly, America is saying, actually, we need to be deeply involved in Europe's economic and political future because our prosperity depends on it. It's not charity. It's calculating foreign policy dressed up in humanitarian language, but it works. Western Europe stabilizes, economies start growing, people who've been living on rations and in rubble start seeing a path back to normalcy. You're living through the moment where America becomes a global superpower, not just militarily, but economically. Soviet Union has the Red Army, but America has dollars, industrial capacity, and a willingness to spend both to shape the world in its preferred image. The Marshall Plan is the visible manifestation of that shift, and it's working. Europe is stabilizing, American influence is expanding, and for the first time since World War I, America is operating as a truly global power, not reluctantly, but intentionally, with long-term strategic plans. The isolationism that dominated American politics for 2 decades is over. You're watching the birth of what'll later be called the American century. But if the Marshall Plan is the heroic, far-sighted side of post-war policy, there's another side to it that's messier and more immediate and genuinely threatening. You're in Germany in 1948, and the economy is falling apart in real time. The Reichsmark, which was already basically worthless because of hyperinflation in the 1920s and Nazi mismanagement in the 1930s, has become completely, utterly meaningless. People aren't even using money anymore for most transactions. They're bartering. Cigarettes, schnapps, coffee, anything physical has more value than the currency. The black market is the only functioning economy. The official economy has basically ceased to exist. The Allied occupation authorities realize they have a serious problem. If the German economy doesn't stabilize soon, Germany is going to either starve or turn communist out of sheer desperation. And since America is now committed to preventing communist expansion, something has to be done. The solution is radical currency reform. On June 20th, 1948, the Deutsche Mark replaces the Reichsmark. But here's the thing. The Deutsche Mark isn't just a name change. It's a complete reset of the currency system. Old money is exchanged for new money at a rate of 100 old Reichsmarks for one new Deutsche Mark. Everyone's savings, essentially worthless anyway, but still, are cut to 100th of their value. But the currency is now backed by something. It's now real money. And suddenly, overnight, the German black market collapses because official economy money actually has value again. It's one of the most successful currency reforms in history, and it happens across all of Western Germany. In the Soviet occupation zone, what'll eventually become East Germany, there's no equivalent reform. The Soviets announced their own currency reform, but it's designed more to confuse the Western zones than to actually fix the economy. The two Germanys, which have been separated administratively since 1945, start becoming economically incompatible. The West gets a currency that works, the East gets currency chaos. One of the fundamental splits that'll define the Cold War is being created right here through banking policy. But the currency reform in the West creates an immediate crisis in Berlin because Berlin's a special case. The city's divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. And for 3 years, this weird arrangement has kind of worked. You can move between zones. You can trade goods. It's tense, but it functions. Now, with the currency reform in the Western zones, the Soviets realize they need to respond. The official Soviet response is to blockade Berlin completely. No supplies go in or out, no food, no coal, no medicine, nothing. It's a calculated gamble on Soviet leader Stalin's part. Berlin is surrounded by Soviet territory. The Western zones can't supply Berlin by road or rail anymore. Stalin figures the Western occupiers will either have to withdraw or starve. Either way, Stalin wins. Berlin becomes Soviet, and if the West really wants to feed Berlin, they have to do it by… what? Flying food in? That's insane. You can't feed a city of 2 million people from the air, except you can. The Allies, especially the Americans, decide to try. Starting in June 1948, American and British cargo planes start flying into Berlin, landing at airports in the Western zones, delivering coal, food, medicine, everything. It's called the Berlin Airlift, and it's the most ambitious humanitarian logistics operation ever attempted up to that point. Day after day, hundreds of flights, bringing in thousands of tons of supplies daily. The American pilot crews start dropping candy attached to little parachutes for the children of Berlin, one of the most human gestures of the entire occupation period. The blockade lasts almost a year. In 1949, before the Soviets finally admit it's not working and reopen the borders. But in that year, something important happens. The people of Berlin, who've been starving and freezing and traumatized by the war, see that the Western powers are willing to go to extraordinary lengths to keep them supplied. They see Soviet Union willing to starve them into submission. They choose the West, and the West, through sheer logistical determination, proves it can deliver on its promises. Historians still argue about whether the Berlin blockade was inevitable or whether it was a stupid mistake on Stalin's part that backfired spectacularly. But what's not arguable is that it fundamentally solidified the division of Germany and Europe. Before the blockade, there was still some possibility that the occupation zones might eventually negotiate some kind of unified German government. After the blockade, that's finished. Germany is going to be 2 countries. The West will have the Marshall Plan money, the functioning currency, and American protection. The East will have Soviet control and economic hardship. One will thrive, one will struggle. The Cold War, which has been technically starting for 3 years now, becomes tangible and visible, and you're watching this unfold from wherever you are in 1948 or 1949. If you're in Western Germany, relief. The Deutsche Mark worked. Stores have goods again. There's hope. If you're in Eastern Germany, despair. The Soviets have made it clear they're willing to starve you into submission. If you're an American, there's a sense of grim determination. You just beat the Nazis. Now you're apparently going to face off against the Soviet Union. The world is not getting simpler. It's getting more complicated. You step out of your bombed-out street corner and look around. Where there used to be a corner shop, now there's just sky. Where your aunt's townhouse stood, there's a rubble heap. And you're not alone in this. Across Britain, across Europe, millions of people are living in the wreckage of what used to be home. But here's the thing about humans. We don't just sit in the ruins and accept them. We rebuild, and we do it in some genuinely creative ways. In Britain, the government makes a decision that's either brilliant or insane, depending on who you ask. They're going to build prefabricated houses. Yes, actual prefab homes, thousands of them. Between 1945 and 1949, they construct 156,623 of these things. These aren't the luxury modular homes you might see on a fancy home design show. They're temporary shelters meant to last about 10 years while proper reconstruction happens. They're small, they're compact, they're made of steel and concrete and plasterboard, and they go up almost overnight. Some are so simple they feel like putting together a very ambitious IKEA project, except the instructions are written by the Ministry of Works and they actually expect things to fit together properly. Here's the funny part though, and you'll see this happen a lot in post-war history. The temporary becomes permanent. These homes that were supposed to be demolished after a decade, some of them are still standing today, more than 70 years later. People got attached to them. They raised families in them. They painted the walls. They planted gardens. They made memories. And by the time the government got around to knocking them down, nobody wanted them to go. A few thousand British people are still living in prefab homes in 2026, probably to their own mild astonishment. But prefabs are just the beginning of Britain's housing strategy. The government also passes something called the New Towns Act in 1946. The basic idea is radical for its time. Why rebuild the old cities exactly as they were, crowded and polluted and messy? Why not plan entirely new communities from scratch? So they do. Towns like Stevenage, Harlow, and Crawley rise up on green fields outside London. These aren't villages. They're planned communities with designated shopping areas, parks, residential zones, all arranged with the kind of geometric precision that makes you feel like you're living in a rational blueprint rather than an organic human settlement. There are roundabouts and wide roads and modern factories placed at a careful distance from where people actually live. It's forward-thinking town planning, the kind that seems genuinely progressive in 1946 and then starts to feel a little too sterile by the 1960s. But that's still a decade away. For now, they're a vision of the modern future. Meanwhile, across the Channel, France and Belgium and the Netherlands are dealing with their own devastation. In France, entire towns have been systematically destroyed. Normandy is a moonscape. There's rubble as far as you can see. The French do what they do. They start from zero. Some towns are rebuilt almost exactly as they were, stone by stone, trying to recover that particular sense of place. Others are rebuilt more functionally, with wider streets and modern amenities. By the 1950s, some French towns will look almost completely reconstructed. Others will look permanently haunted by what happened. In Germany, the situation is even more complex because Germany is being occupied by 4 different countries. Each zone rebuilds according to slightly different priorities. The Americans want efficient modern cities, the British are somewhere in the middle, the French are still angry, and the Soviets, well, they're extracting whatever they can while also theoretically building the future socialist state. German towns are rebuilt slowly, carefully, often with a degree of restraint that shows how thoroughly the nation has been exhausted. But there's something else happening in the rebuild. People aren't just reconstructing buildings, they're imagining new kinds of homes entirely. Modern design is becoming a thing. The idea that a home should be functional, efficient, that it should incorporate the latest technology, that it should be designed by architects with actual vision rather than just built according to custom and tradition. It's exciting in a way that's hard to capture unless you remember what Victorian and Edwardian homes were like. Dark, overcomplicated, full of rooms that nobody used, plumbing that barely worked. Now you can have a kitchen that actually functions well, a bathroom that isn't a separate building outside, homes with good insulation, natural light, open-plan living. It's modest stuff by modern standards, but it feels like the future arriving. And then there's the National Insurance Act of 1946 in Britain, which is technically about housing policy just as much as it is about healthcare. The idea is that society as a whole is going to take responsibility for making sure everyone has shelter, has medical care, has basic security. It seems radical at the time. It still seems pretty good now, honestly. The government is saying, we survived this together, we suffered together, and now we're going to rebuild together. That's not necessarily socialist, though it gets accused of being so by plenty of people. It's just saying that basic needs shouldn't be left to chance or charity. They should be guaranteed. And so alongside the housing construction, they're also setting up the National Health Service in 1948, which means that a person can get sick or injured without worrying that they're going to lose their home because of medical bills. It's a small thing in some ways, a big thing in others. Historians still argue about whether the new towns were a success or a failure. They provided housing, certainly, but they also displaced communities, created sterile environments, and sometimes felt more like social experiments than places people actually wanted to live. The answer, as always with post-war reconstruction, is complicated. They were both. By 1949, the reconstruction of homes and the creation of new homes is well underway. It's not complete. Not nearly. There are still hundreds of thousands of people living in temporary accommodation, in squatter camps, in hostels, but there's visible progress. You can walk down a street in London and see new buildings rising. You can take a train out to Stevenage and see an entire town being created, planned, and orderly and full of possibility. There's hope in it. There's also a certain amount of enforced modernism and the loss of community character that some people will regret, but that's a subtler conversation that mostly happens later. For now, the point is this. We're building again. We're making space for people to live. We're saying that home isn't going to be a ruin anymore. While all this rebuilding is happening, something else is crystallizing. A few years ago, during the war itself, the idea of what comes after seemed simple enough. There's us, there's them, there's good, and there's evil. But victory was supposed to solve all that. Victory was supposed to bring peace. And now peace is here. And instead of getting simpler, the world is getting more complex, more divided, more dangerous in entirely new ways. The Soviet Union and the United States won together, but they never really trusted each other. Their systems are incompatible. Their visions of what a post-war world should look like are fundamentally opposed. Stalin wants Soviet influence extending into Eastern Europe, creating a buffer of allied states between the Soviet Union and the West. The Americans want open markets, democratic elections, the spread of capitalism, and Western values. These aren't small disagreements. These are visions of how human society should be organized, and there's no middle ground. So the old alliance fractures almost immediately. Not into hot war. Nobody wants another world war. Nobody could survive it. But into a kind of cold confrontation. A Cold War, as people will start calling it. It's competition, tension, rivalry, proxy conflicts in smaller countries, an arms race that grows larger every year, but not direct military confrontation between the superpowers themselves. That restraint probably keeps the world from ending, to be honest. On April 4th, 1949, the Western nations formalize their response. They create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. It's a military alliance, a collective defense agreement. Article 5 says that an attack on one member is an attack on all. The message is clear. The Soviet Union, don't try to expand further into Western Europe because we will respond together. The Soviets will create their own alliance in Eastern Europe, the Warsaw Pact, in a few years. The map of Europe is essentially frozen into two sides, and then in August of 1949, something happens that changes the calculus entirely. The Soviet Union tests their first atomic bomb. The Americans had assumed they had a monopoly on nuclear weapons, that they had years before the Soviets could develop the bomb. But they're wrong. Soviet physicists, working partly from stolen American designs and partly from their own genius, have built a bomb. The world has gone from having one nuclear-armed superpower to having two. The clock has restarted. The vulnerability is mutual now, and that's actually, weirdly, somewhat stabilizing. If both sides can destroy each other, both sides have a strong incentive not to start a war. But it doesn't feel stabilizing. It feels terrifying. This is the atomic age. It's an age where humanity has developed a weapon that could end civilization. You can't unhear that news. You can't go back to not knowing it. Some people start building bomb shelters in their gardens. Others start writing fiction about atomic apocalypse. Still others decide to focus on living their lives and trying not to think about it, which is actually the most common response. The bomb exists, yes, but you have groceries to buy and children to feed and a house to rebuild. You can't spend all your time thinking about nuclear annihilation. The atomic age is also, paradoxically, an age of hope about nuclear energy. This same power that could destroy the world could also power cities, cure diseases, provide unlimited energy. The atom becomes a symbol of the future in a way that's hard to understand unless you remember this moment. It represents both ultimate danger and ultimate promise. That contradiction never really gets resolved. It just gets more complicated as time goes on. NATO is supposed to be a defensive alliance, but it's also clearly a response to the Soviet Union specifically, and that matters. The message is, there is a world divided into two camps, and you have to choose which one you're in. The countries of Western Europe choose the American camp. The countries of Eastern Europe, well, they don't really get a choice, but they're in the Soviet camp. The rest of the world watches and calculates and tries to figure out which side is safer, which side offers more stability, which side represents the future. And here's where it gets a little tricky. Because the United States, which is supposed to be the defender of democracy and freedom and all those things, is also pretty relaxed about supporting anti-democratic authoritarian governments as long as they're anti-communist. It's the beginning of a strategy that will define American foreign policy for decades. Support anybody who opposes the Soviet Union, regardless of whether they're nice or democratic or have respect for human rights. It makes sense from a pure strategic perspective, but it's going to create a lot of problems later. Historians still argue about whether the Cold War was inevitable, or whether it could have been avoided through better diplomacy. The optimists say there was a window of opportunity in 1945 and 1946 where the Allies could have maintained cooperation. The pessimists say the fundamental ideological differences between capitalism and communism made confrontation unavoidable. Either way, by 1949, the Cold War is reality. It's not going away. And the world that was supposed to be rebuilt after the war is instead being rebuilt in the shadow of a new kind of conflict. The world is dividing. It's not a division that happened suddenly. It's been happening gradually since 1945, with the Yalta Conference and the occupation zones and the disagreements over Poland and the rest. But now it's real. It's formalized. It's hardening into something that will persist for 4 decades. You don't know that yet. In 1949, you can't know that the Cold War will define the second half of the 20th century, but you can feel it. You can feel the division. You can feel the tension. It's palpable. It's become the structure of the world. But there's more happening than just the Cold War dividing Europe and establishing NATO. There's the question of what happens to the world's displaced people. During the war and immediately after, you have millions of refugees, millions of people without homes or nations or countries. Where do they go? Who takes them? And that question becomes urgent and complicated, and in some cases tragic. One place where millions of displaced persons want to go is Palestine. Jews who survived the Holocaust, who lost everything, want to go to the land that the Zionist movement has been developing for decades. The land they believe they have a historical and religious right to. In 1948, on May 14th, the State of Israel declares independence. It's a momentous thing. After 2,000 years without a Jewish nation-state, there is now a Jewish nation-state. Many displaced persons from Europe, survivors of the camps, make their way there. They build kibbutzim. They rebuild their lives in this new place. For many of them, it feels like the only home they've ever known is being offered back to them. It's profound. But Palestine is also inhabited by Arabs who have lived there for centuries, by Palestinians who have their own history, their own connection to the land, their own sense that they belong there. The establishment of Israel displaces Palestinian Arabs. Tens of thousands of them become refugees themselves. Some leave because they're forced out. Some leave because they're afraid. Some because they're caught in the violence between Jewish militias and Arab militias that erupts almost immediately. It's the beginning of a conflict that's still ongoing as you're listening to this that will cause immense suffering for generations. Most people in 1948 don't fully grasp the magnitude of what they're setting in motion. They just see people trying to go home or trying to protect what they see as home. The moral clarity that the Holocaust seemed to provide dissolves very quickly into moral complexity. But that's not the only massive displacement happening. Simultaneously, in 1947, the British Raj in India ends. India gains independence. But the independence comes with a partition. The land is divided into India and Pakistan based on religion. India is for Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, and other religions, while Pakistan is for Muslims. The idea is that this will create two nation-states where minorities won't feel threatened. It's a logical-seeming solution from a distance. It's a catastrophic idea in practice. What follows is the largest mass migration in human history. 15 million people are displaced. Hindus and Sikhs in what is now Pakistan try to move to India. Muslims in what is now India try to move to Pakistan. The violence is staggering. Entire trains full of refugees arrive at their destinations with everyone aboard dead. Communities that had lived together for centuries turn on each other. There are massacres. There are forced conversions. There is rape and murder and ethnic cleansing happening on a scale that shocks even a world that has just gotten used to the Holocaust. Mahatma Gandhi is assassinated by a Hindu nationalist who thinks he wasn't hard enough on Pakistan. Somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million people die. Some historians argue it was closer to 3 million. The exact death toll is one of those things historians still argue about, which is a way of saying that it's so large that we can't even count it accurately, and the uncertainty itself is disturbing. By 1950, roughly 14 million people have been relocated. Entire village structures are shattered. Families are split across borders that are brand new. Languages and religions that had existed side by side are now separated. The scars from this take generations to heal. Some of them haven't healed yet. What makes this relevant to the post-war reconstruction story is that this is happening at the same time as the European rebuilding. While Britain is constructing prefab homes and planning new towns, it's also abandoning an empire that will create 15 million refugees and leave behind one of the largest humanitarian crises in history. The irony isn't lost on some observers. Britain is caring for its own people, helping them rebuild their homes, while contributing to the displacement of millions in India, Pakistan, and Palestine. But people in Britain don't think about it in those terms, mostly. If they think about India at all, it's with a sense of loss. They've lost an empire that provided wealth, status, and power. They don't spend much time thinking about what independence means for the Indians and Pakistanis themselves, or what it means for the refugees created by the partition. That's not callousness exactly. It's more that the mental energy available is focused on home, on survival, on rebuilding. The rest of the world is somewhat abstract. Still, some people do make their way from India and Pakistan to Britain, and from Palestine and Europe to Israel, and the world is being remapped according to new lines, new nations, new boundaries. The principle of self-determination, that people have the right to govern themselves, is being applied but inconsistently and painfully. Some people get nation-states, some people get displaced. Some people get their independence and find it's not what they expected. The world is becoming less simple, more varied, and in some ways more troubled, even as it's becoming less directly violent. You're in Germany. Specifically, you're in West Germany in the American occupation zone. For the past few years, life has been grim. You're hungry. You're cold in the winter. The currency, the Reichsmark, is basically worthless. Everyone's using cigarettes as money, or bartering, or just stealing what they can to survive. The black market is the real economy. The official economy doesn't work. Trade doesn't work. You're still living in the rubble in many places. And then, in 1948, something shifts. The currency reform happens. The old Reichsmark is replaced by the Deutsche Mark, the D-Mark. It's a real currency backed by actual value, and suddenly people have an incentive to work again, to trade, to put goods in shops instead of hoarding them, or selling them on the black market. The shelves that have been empty start to fill. It sounds like magic, but it's actually just basic economics. When you have a currency that's worth something, people start behaving like capitalists again. But it's more than just the currency reform. It's American investment. It's the Marshall Plan pouring money into West Germany, helping it rebuild its industry, its infrastructure, its economy. It's the recognition that a prosperous Germany is going to be more stable than an impoverished, resentful Germany. And it's also the German people themselves who are incredibly industrious, incredibly focused on rebuilding, incredibly determined to make this work. By the late 1940s, West Germany enters what economists will later call the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Growth explodes, factories reopen, production increases. Shops have goods on shelves. Within a few years, West Germany goes from being a devastated, starving nation to being on the path to becoming one of the richest countries in Europe. It's one of the most dramatic economic recoveries in history, and it's happening in part because of the division of Germany. East Germany, under Soviet control, is also trying to rebuild, but it's doing so according to Soviet economic principles: state planning, state ownership of industry, no real consumer goods. It's slower, more bureaucratic, less efficient. By the early 1950s, it's clear that West Germany is recovering faster and more impressively than East Germany. That difference will persist. It's one of the reasons that, decades later, people will risk their lives trying to escape from East Germany to West Germany. The economic disparity is real and it's visible. For ordinary people in West Germany, the Wirtschaftswunder means something specific. There's food in the shops. You can buy it if you have money, which more people do because there are jobs again. There are actual jobs, real employment, with real wages that buy real things. The stores have goods that a few years ago you would have thought impossible. Coffee, chocolate, real meat, not just organ meat and bones to make soup. It's not extravagant, it's not luxurious, but it's enough. It's more than survival. There's a famous newsreel from this period showing an elderly woman in Berlin or Munich looking at the goods in a shop window and crying. Just crying at the sight of normal consumer goods. That image captures something about what the economic miracle means to people who've been hungry for years. It means not starving. It means that civilization is being rebuilt. It means that there's a future. And here's a weird thing about economic recovery. It's not just about the goods. It's about hope. It's about believing that things are going to get better, and that belief becomes self-fulfilling. People work harder because they think there's a point to it. Businesses invest because they think the economy is going to grow. And it does grow. The economy is about psychology as much as it's about production and currency and capital. When people feel like the future is worth building, they build it. And West Germany, having been defeated, having been occupied, having been through the worst horrors of the war, decides that it's worth building the future. Historians still argue about what caused the Wirtschaftswunder. Was it the currency reform, the Marshall Plan, German industriousness, or just the natural rebound effect of an economy that had hit absolute bottom? The answer is probably all of the above. No single factor explains it. But together, they created the conditions for one of the most remarkable economic recoveries in modern history. It's not universal, of course. Not everyone benefits equally. There are still poor people. There are still people working in coal mines and factories and doing dangerous, low-wage labor. Women are being pushed out of the workforce to make room for returning soldiers. So the gender economy is more unequal than it was during the war. But the direction is clear. Things are getting better. Food is returning. Industry is coming back. Jobs are available. Wages are rising. And that matters more than you might think, because despair is contagious, but so is hope. If you believe things are getting better, you work toward making them better. If you believe things are getting worse, or just staying the same forever, you give up. The Wirtschaftswunder is partly the result of deliberate policy and investment, but it's also the result of millions of individual Germans deciding that rebuilding is worth the effort. While homes are being rebuilt and economies are beginning to recover, something else is happening. It's quieter, less visible than construction or currency reform, but it's profound. People are trying to process what happened. They're trying to understand the war, to make sense of it, to find meaning in it. And they're doing it through art and music and film and literature. In 1946 in Britain, there's a film called Brief Encounter that comes out. It's about two ordinary people who have a brief affair, and nothing comes of it. They go back to their ordinary lives. And millions of British people watch this film and find it completely gripping, completely moving, even though nothing dramatic happens. That's the point, actually. The film is about ordinary emotions, ordinary disappointments, ordinary desires and sacrifices. After years of extraordinary events, bombs and invasion and rationing and death, the ordinary feels profound. The intimate feels important. A brief encounter between two people becomes a tragedy. Films are doing important work in this period. There are comedies that help people laugh at their situation, which is therapeutic. There are dramas that help people process grief. There are adventure films that offer escape. In Italy, neorealism becomes a film movement. Filmmakers go into the streets, film real locations, cast real people, and tell stories about actual post-war life, poverty, unemployment, desperation. A film like Rome, Open City, or The Bicycle Thieves shows the real conditions that people are living in while also treating those conditions with dignity and compassion. In Germany, the situation is more complicated because German cinema becomes instantly suspect. The Nazis made propaganda films for 12 years, and now the Germans who made films have to reconcile with that. They have to figure out how to make art in a nation that just tried to exterminate an entire people. Some filmmakers go into exile rather than dealing with it. Others try to grapple with what happened. It's slow and awkward and painful. Music is safer somehow. There's a lot of jazz coming from America, which is exciting and modern and symbolizes cultural vitality. There's traditional folk music in various countries that connects people to something that existed before the war, before the Nazis, before the devastation. There are new composers trying to figure out how to write classical music after the Holocaust. Some of them decide that traditional forms are insufficient, and they develop new kinds of music. Atonal music, serialist music, things that break with the past because the past itself has become morally suspect. In literature, there's an explosion of memoirs. People are writing down what they lived through. Survivors of the camps are testifying. Soldiers are writing about their experiences. Refugees are telling their stories. Anne Frank's diary, hidden during the war, is discovered and published in 1947. It becomes a way for millions of people to understand what the Holocaust meant, not as a statistic, but as a human reality, as the voice of a teenage girl who was lost to it. That's powerful. But there's also philosophy and theology grappling with the fundamental question, how do we understand what just happened? How do we believe in God or progress or human goodness after the Holocaust? The war has shaken the foundations of Western thought. It's not just that millions of people died, it's that they died as part of a systematic, industrial, bureaucratic project to exterminate an entire people. It's that the most educated, most cultured nation in Europe organized the deaths. It's that ordinary people participated in it, and that's the most disturbing part. If ordinary people can do this, what does that say about humanity? Existentialism becomes popular in this period, especially in France. The idea that existence precedes essence, that we're thrown into a world without predetermined meaning, that we have to create meaning through our actions. It resonates deeply with people who've just lived through a war. That seemed to demonstrate that traditional meaning-making systems, nationalism, religion, political ideology, had failed catastrophically. If nothing is guaranteed, if we're fundamentally alone and responsible for our own choices, then maybe the only thing that matters is how we choose to live right now. In Britain, the rebuilding of Coventry Cathedral becomes a symbol of healing. The old cathedral was destroyed in bombing in 1940. Instead of just reproducing it exactly, architects designed a new cathedral next to the ruins of the old one. The new building is modern, made of concrete and glass and steel, incorporating new materials and new aesthetics, but it's placed next to the old ruins, which are preserved. It's a physical statement. We remember what was lost, and we're building something new alongside it. We're not pretending the past didn't happen. We're not just erasing the damage. We're building forward while honoring what came before. And then there's the simple matter of war brides. About 70,000 British women married American soldiers during the war, and after the war, they emigrate to America. For them, rebuilding home means leaving home. It's a strange kind of displacement. They're not refugees. They're not fleeing danger. They're actively choosing to leave their country and go to a new one, usually for romantic love. Some of them thrive in America. Some of them desperately miss Britain. Many of them are in between, homesick but also excited, grieving what they've left, but looking forward to what they'll find. Their stories become part of the larger narrative of post-war migration and displacement. Historians still argue about whether post-war culture was primarily about healing or about avoidance. Were people processing trauma through art, or were they using entertainment to avoid thinking about it? The answer, predictably, is both. Some art confronted the horror directly. Some art offered escape. Most people needed both, a way to face what happened, and a way to forget it long enough to get through the day. Culture in this period is how people heal. It's how they process trauma. It's how they imagine futures that are different from their pasts. When you can laugh at a film about the ordinary disappointments of life, you're saying that you're ready to live an ordinary life again. When you can read a poem or listen to a song, you're saying that beauty still exists and still matters. When you can visit a rebuilt cathedral or watch a film about real people struggling with real problems, you're saying that meaning can be made even after catastrophe. That's not small. That's everything. You're sitting in a small office in Paris in 1951, and on the desk in front of you is a document that would reshape an entire continent. It's not flashy. It's not revolutionary in the way bombs are revolutionary, but this piece of paper, the Treaty of Paris, is about to do something that armies and politics had failed to do for centuries. It's going to make it nearly impossible for France and Germany to go to war again, and it does this through the most boring, beautiful idea imaginable. They're going to share their coal and steel. This is the European coal and steel community, and you have to understand how radical this actually is. Coal and steel aren't just resources, they're weapons. They're the sinew and bone of industrial power. For France to voluntarily link its coal reserves with Germany's steel capacity just 6 years after Germany tried to exterminate French culture is like asking two fighters who just finished a brutal match to enter into a permanent business partnership. And yet, here they are, along with Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Italy, doing exactly that. The man behind much of this thinking is Jean Monnet, a French economist who understood something fundamental. You can't maintain old hatreds when you're economically bound together. When you need each other's resources, when your workers are employed by the other fellow's factories, when your prosperity depends on the other guy's success, well, starting a war becomes a terrible business decision. It sounds cynical maybe, but historians still argue whether economic integration was actually a stronger force for peace than any treaty could ever be. And the fact that Western Europe has largely avoided major internal conflicts since 1951 suggests Monnet might have been onto something. This isn't just about preventing future wars, though. There's an idealism here, too. You can feel it in the room where these men gather to negotiate. There's a sense that from the ashes of something terrible, something new and better might be built. Not a return to old ways. Those ways led here to rubble and ash. But something genuinely new, a new kind of European cooperation, a supranational organization where nations agreed to bind themselves together, to surrender certain powers to a common authority. By 1957, this experiment is going further. 6 nations sign the Treaty of Rome, creating the European Economic Community. The EEC aims to eliminate tariffs between member states to allow goods and people to move freely across borders that have been fortified, mined, and patrolled for centuries. It's a vision of Europe not as competing empires, but as a common market, a shared economic space. You can imagine the skeptics at the time. It'll never work, they said. National interests are too strong. But here you are, in the middle of the 20th century, watching nations voluntarily pool their sovereignty in pursuit of something larger than themselves. There's something almost romantic about it when you think about it from a safe distance. But you have to remember what makes it possible: shared trauma. These nations aren't doing this because they suddenly love each other. They're doing this because they've seen what happens when nationalism runs unchecked. They've walked through their own ruins. They've counted their dead. And they've decided that whatever it takes, economic integration, political union, shared institutions, it's worth it to prevent that from happening again. The rebuilding of Europe is also, in a very real sense, the building of something that didn't exist before, a genuinely shared European project. Not an empire conquered by one nation, not a balance of terror between equals, but a voluntary association of nations, each surrendering something, each gaining something in return. It's imperfect, it's messy, the negotiations are brutal, but it works. And while Western Europe is learning to live together in new ways, something equally important is happening in the public consciousness. The idea of Europe itself is being rebuilt. Not as a collection of warring kingdoms and empires, but as a shared cultural and political space. Young people are beginning to think of themselves not just as French or German or Italian, but as European. It's a stunning shift, one that would have been unimaginable in 1945, when Europe was still smoking. By the late 1950s, when you look at maps, you can see the physical changes too. Roads are being rebuilt. The infrastructure of war, fortifications, bunkers, minefields, is being cleared away. In its place come highways connecting nations, railways linking cities that had been enemies. These aren't neutral infrastructure projects. They're statements. They're saying, we're building a future together. The coal and steel community, the EEC, the movement toward European integration, these are the bones of what will eventually become the European Union. But in 1951, in 1957, nobody knows that yet. What they know is that they're trying something new, something that might prevent their children from knowing the war that they've just survived. And right now, in the early 1950s, that feels like enough. But here's the thing about rebuilding. You can rebuild the buildings. You can rebuild the economy. You can sign treaties and create new institutions, but you can't rebuild people, not really. The scars remain. They're just not always visible. Walk through Warsaw in the early 1950s, and you're walking through a city that was 85% destroyed. That's not hyperbole. That's not an exaggeration. That's the actual percentage of a major European capital that was leveled. The Soviet army liberated it from Nazi occupation in 1945, and what they found was less a city and more an archaeological site of rubble. But the Poles have decided to rebuild it, and they're doing something extraordinary. They're using paintings. You see, there was a Polish painter from the 18th century, Bernardo Bellotto, nephew of the more famous Canaletto, who painted the city extensively. His paintings are meticulous. They're so detailed that you can see individual buildings, the precise facades, the layout of streets. So the Polish architects and historians use these paintings almost like blueprints. They rebuild Warsaw not as it was becoming, but as it was. They resurrect the old city from paint and memory. It's a beautiful act of defiance and love, really. We're so destroyed, the paintings seem to say, that we have to rebuild ourselves from art. But what do you do with the trauma that doesn't show up in Canaletto's paintings? What do you do with the memories? Across Europe, people are trying to figure this out. In the camps and displaced person centers, the survivors are being counted, registered, processed. By 1957, the last DP camps will close. The last official displaced persons will be resettled or repatriated, but there are people who have no country to return to. Jews who survived the Holocaust find that their homes were taken, their families were murdered, their entire worlds were erased. Some go to Israel, which was just created in 1948. Some go to America. Some stay in Europe, building new lives in countries that killed 6 million of their people. There are monuments being built now, ways of remembering, of making sure the world never forgets. In 1950, the Auschwitz concentration camp is preserved as a memorial. It's one of the few sites where the Nazi machine of genocide was industrialized so completely that it becomes a kind of museum, a record in brick and barbed wire. And yes, Historians still argue whether monuments and memorials are actually effective at preventing future atrocities, or whether they let us feel like we've done something about the past by simply remembering it. But they're being built anyway, because silence feels worse than any memorial. There's also a very practical reckoning happening with the past. The Nuremberg trials concluded in 1946, but there are many more trials happening in the years after. In Germany, in Poland, in France, the collaborators and the perpetrators are being tried. Some are executed, some are imprisoned, some escape. Some are quietly allowed to return to normal life. And yes, that happened, and it troubles people even now. The question of justice, of how to punish those responsible while also rebuilding society, turns out to be incredibly complicated. You can't execute everyone who was complicit, but how do you forgive? In Japan, the process is different, but no less fraught. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, which concludes in 1948, tries Japanese war criminals. Emperor Hirohito is not prosecuted. MacArthur decides, arguably controversially, that prosecuting the emperor would destabilize the occupation, so Hirohito remains as a figurehead while Japan rebuilds. The trauma of the atomic bombs, the firebombing campaigns, the occupation itself, these create a complicated relationship with the past. Japan will rebuild its economy faster than almost any nation. But the psychological weight of what happened, the bombs, the war, the occupation, will shape Japanese culture for generations. And then there's the matter of memory itself. What do you choose to remember? What do you choose to forget? In some places, the rubble is cleared away quickly and new buildings are constructed on top of the old sites. In other places, the destruction is preserved, made into a kind of permanent memorial. In West Germany, for instance, some churches bombed during the war are left partially ruined as reminders. The Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church in Berlin is deliberately preserved in its damaged state. A new modern church is built next to it, creating a conversation between old and new, between what was destroyed and what's being created. The trauma also shows up in less visible ways. The children born in the decade after the war, the first generation that doesn't remember it, are nevertheless shaped by it. Their parents carry the weight. The food is still rationed. The cities are still being rebuilt. There's an anxiety in the air, a sense that things are fragile, that they could break apart again. And for those who lived through it, the soldiers, the civilians, the survivors, there's a kind of exhaustion that comes from having seen humanity at its worst. Slowly, over the years of the 1950s, Europe is learning to live with its past rather than being destroyed by it. But the scars remain. They always will. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the scars are a kind of insurance against forgetting. You look at the ruined church in Berlin, or you walk through the rebuilt streets of Warsaw, and you remember this happened. We did this to ourselves. We must never do it again. Now let's talk about something that might seem trivial compared to everything else we've discussed, but actually changed daily life more than almost anything else: the television. In 1950, television is still a luxury. Maybe you've seen one in a shop window or in a neighbor's living room. It's a bulky wooden cabinet with a small screen, and the picture comes in grainy and often goes out for no good reason. But by the mid-1950s, TVs are in millions of homes. By 1960, television is becoming normal, and this is revolutionary, not just for entertainment, but for how people understand the world. Before television, most people got their news from newspapers or radio. Information was delayed. You heard about something that happened yesterday, but with television, there's an immediacy that's new. You can see events as they happen, or at least see them reported within hours. This changes how people think about history, about current events, about their place in the world. And interestingly, television is also a tool of reconciliation. You watch events happening in other countries, see people who look like you living lives similar to yours, and it becomes harder to maintain the kind of abstract hatred that's easier to feel toward people you never see. But television is also part of something bigger, the consumer culture that's emerging in the 1950s. The war was about scarcity, rationing, making do. But now, as economies recover and grow, there's abundance, or the promise of abundance anyway. In Britain, rationing finally ends in 1954. Meat and bacon are the last items to come off the ration list, and there's actually celebration about it, which tells you something about how much these years of deprivation meant. In America, the post-war boom is creating suburbs like Levittown, where you can buy a house for a few $1,000s and start a new life. By the mid-1950s, the American economy is producing cars and consumer goods at an unprecedented rate. This is the world of the 1950s that's being built on top of the rubble of the 1940s. It's a world of appliances, refrigerators that don't require ice delivery, washing machines that transform laundry from an all-day task to something you can do while listening to the radio, vacuum cleaners, electric stoves, all the labor-saving devices that mean, and this is crucial, that the women who were pulled into factories during the war to replace the men at war are now being told they should go home. The post-war world is economically prosperous, but socially conservative. The message is clear. Your job was temporary. Go back to being wives and mothers. It's not a message everyone accepts, but it's powerful. And interestingly, even as women are being pushed out of industrial jobs, new kinds of work are opening up for them. Secretarial work, nursing, teaching. These are deemed appropriate for women, which is to say they're lower paid than industrial work. The economic recovery is real, but it's not equally distributed. Meanwhile, West Germany is experiencing something remarkable. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, is in full swing. The currency reform of 1948 stopped hyperinflation dead. By 1950, industrial output in Europe as a whole had exceeded pre-war levels, but West Germany is growing even faster. By 1955, West Germany has become the world's third-largest economy. Unemployment, which was 11% in 1950, drops to just 1.3% by 1960. People are working, people are earning, people are building new lives. In Japan, something similar is happening. The Korean War, which starts in 1950 and runs until 1953, actually boosts the Japanese economy. American military procurement during the war means Japanese factories are humming, producing supplies for the war effort. It's grim. Japanese workers are benefiting from a war that's killing Koreans, but it's also economic oxygen. By the end of the 1950s, Japan is rebuilding its industrial base faster than perhaps any nation in history. There's also the baby boom. In America especially, but across the developed world, families are having children at unprecedented rates. The peak year is 1957, when there are more babies born in America per capita than at any other time before or since. These babies, you, probably, if you were born in the late 1950s, are growing up in a world of apparent peace and prosperity. Your parents survived the war. Now they're building something for you. Schools are being constructed. Suburbs are expanding. The future seems open. But here's the thing. Underneath all of this prosperity and consumer abundance, there's also a new kind of anxiety. The atomic bomb exists. The Soviet Union has one too, as of 1949. The Berlin blockade happened. The Korean War is happening. There's a sense that the peace is fragile, that this prosperity could be obliterated in the flash of a nuclear explosion. Civil defense programs include instructions for what to do in case of atomic attack. Spoiler alert, there's really nothing you can do, but trying to prepare gives people a sense of control. Historians still argue about whether the 1950s were a golden age or a powder keg. The prosperity was real, the anxiety was real, the inequality was real, the consumer abundance was real. All of these things existed simultaneously, and depending on where you were and who you were, the decade looked very different. So the world being built in the 1950s is prosperous but anxious. It's abundant but also conscious of scarcity. It's optimistic about the future but aware that the future could be terrible. And it's connected in new ways, through television, through rebuilt infrastructure, through international institutions like NATO and the emerging European Economic Community. The world is becoming smaller, more connected, more interdependent, for better and worse. Imagine you're in the year 2000, looking back at the 1950s from 50 years away. What do you see? You see a period where the world genuinely seemed possible to rebuild. The destruction was so complete that there was almost a blank slate, not for the people who lived through it, but for the physical infrastructure. And in that moment, when everything had to be rebuilt anyway, choices were made about what kind of world to build. Some of those choices were good. Some were mistakes. But they were choices, and they shaped everything that came after. The integration of Europe, which started with the coal and steel community and continued through the European Economic Community, turned out to be profoundly consequential. Yes, historians still argue whether the EU is a force for good or a bureaucratic nightmare, or some complicated mixture of both. But one thing that's hard to argue is that the European nations that integrated after World War II have not gone to war with each other since. The track record is remarkable. For a continent that had known nearly constant warfare for centuries, for 2 catastrophic world wars in 30 years, the sudden stability is historic. Maybe economic integration really is stronger than the strongest military deterrent. The Japanese and German recoveries were also stunning. Both nations were utterly defeated, occupied, their militaries dismantled. Both would rebuild to become economic superpowers. Both would do so with new constitutions. West Germany committing itself to democracy, Japan renouncing war as a tool of state policy. These weren't inevitable outcomes. They happened because of specific choices made during the occupation and in the years after. MacArthur's decision to keep Emperor Hirohito was controversial, but it preserved continuity that helped stabilize Japan. The Marshall Plan wasn't inevitable. Congress had to approve it, and it faced significant opposition. But it happened, and it probably prevented the kind of desperate poverty that might have pushed Europe toward communism or fascism. What was lost in this rebuilding? Well, a lot of the old world. The European empires are beginning to fade. India and Pakistan are independent now. Israel exists. Indonesia is fighting for independence from the Dutch. The Suez Crisis in 1956 makes it clear that Britain and France are no longer the imperial powers they once were. The world is being divided into 2 camps, the Soviet sphere and the American sphere, rather than the old European colonial order. Some people experienced this as liberation. Others experienced it as catastrophic loss. Historians still argue about whether the end of European colonialism was inevitable or whether it was hastened by the depleted resources and military capacity of Europe after the war. There's also something that was lost in terms of culture and tradition. When cities were rebuilt, sometimes they were rebuilt in new ways. When societies reorganized themselves around new economic and political systems, older ways of life disappeared. The peasant cultures of Europe were already fading before the war, but the post-war period accelerated the move from rural to urban life, from traditional communities to nuclear families in suburbs. This was progress in many ways: better healthcare, better education, more opportunity. But it was also loss. Communities that had existed for centuries were broken apart in the name of efficiency and modernity. And let's not forget the people who were left out of the recovery, the Holocaust survivors who found no home to return to, the millions of Germans and Eastern Europeans displaced by the new borders, the colonial subjects in Asia and Africa who were told they were being liberated into independence, but often found themselves impoverished and exploited by new kinds of colonialism. The women who were pushed out of industrial jobs into lower-paying work or into domestic servitude. The recovery was real, but it was unequal. Yet, if you're looking back from the year 2000, you also have to acknowledge it worked. The world that was built in the 1950s, for all its flaws, was more prosperous, more peaceful in most places, more connected, more educated than the world before the war. Life expectancy increased. Literacy rates went up. Children had schools to attend. Workers had jobs. There was food to eat. And there was also something like hope. People genuinely believed they were building a better future. They were working toward something. They were making sacrifices, rationing, austerity, hard work, because they believed it would lead somewhere, and for the most part, it did. The children born in the late 1950s grew up in relative peace and prosperity. They went to university in larger numbers than any generation before them. They had more choices in career, in where to live, and whom to marry, than their parents did. The rebuilding of the world after 1945 wasn't some grand plan. It was a series of decisions made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Some of those decisions were brilliant, some were tragic. But together, they created a world that, despite its massive flaws and injustices, was better than the one that came before. Not perfect, not without serious problems, but better. And sometimes, when you're rebuilding from ash, better is remarkable. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the decade after the war. We've walked through the rubble. We've seen the hunger and the hope, the justice and the compromise, the terrible choices and the moments of genuine human kindness. And now, as the 1950s settle into their grooves, we're going to let our story wind down, just like you're winding down, getting ready for sleep. There's something peaceful about this moment in history, if you think about it from a distance. The war is over. The immediate crisis is passing. The rebuilding is happening. Gardens are growing. Children are being born. Schools are opening. And while the future still feels uncertain, the Cold War is escalating after all, and there are tensions everywhere. There's also a sense of stability. The worst is behind us. We can build now. We can rest. Think about what was accomplished in just a decade. An entire continent rebuilt. New nations created. Old empires relinquished. Economic systems reformed, millions of lives relocated, restarted, renewed. It's almost unimaginable, really, that so much change happened so quickly. And it happened not through some grand master plan, but through millions of small decisions made by people who were simply trying to rebuild their lives and their countries. The rubble women who cleared the bricks are resting now. The soldiers who came home are growing old. The children born in the DP camps are starting school. The factories are humming. The roads are being paved. Television sets are glowing in living rooms. And maybe, just maybe, people are beginning to believe that they won't have to do this again, that the next war won't come, that the world they're building might last. Of course, it won't be that simple. The Cold War will intensify. There will be more conflicts, more pain, more uncertainty. But right now, in this moment, as the 1950s settle in, there's rest, there's recovery, there's the feeling that you've been through something terrible and survived it. And that's where we'll leave our story, with the rebuilding underway, with the hope that peace might hold, with the quiet certainty that human beings can endure almost anything, and afterward, they can build something new. Sleep well. You've earned it. End of script. Sweet dreams.